Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the silken sheets and scandal-heavy shadows of royal bedrooms. The kind of stories where crowns are worn dropped and sometimes tied to the bedposts. You're about to learn how lust, love, and a very strategic lack of pants quite literally changed the fate of empires. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this journey unscathed, not emotionally anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your city and local time in the comments, so I know who's up way too late with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with a man so desperate for a male heir, he tore Europe's most powerful religious body in two. Yep. Henry VIII. If you thought ghosting someone was bad, wait till you hear what this guy did to his wives. You settle into the court of Tudor England, an age of velvet cloaks, whispered alliances, and executions dressed up as legal procedures. Henry, once a handsome athlete and musician, is now thickening around the middle, limping from a festering leg wound, and increasingly paranoid. But beneath all that royal weight is a man whose entire self-worth rides on producing a son. One legitimate son, because in his world, girls can't wear crowns, not in England, not yet. Enter Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. She's royal Spanish stock, strong and pious, and she's endured several miscarriages and stillbirths. They had a daughter, Mary, but that wasn't good enough. Not for a king whose ego filled every chapel. Henry believes he's cursed. His logic? Catherine was once married to his brother Arthur. Arthur died. So clearly Henry assumes that his marriage to her is unclean in God's eyes. Of course, this realization comes conveniently right around the time he becomes infatuated with one very smart, very fashionable, very unavailable woman, Anne Boleyn. Here's where the sex scandal starts pulling levers on a global scale. Henry wants Anne, but Anne isn't interested in being just another royal mistress. She says no, repeatedly. She flirts, yes. She allows just enough access to keep him obsessed. But she withholds the full, throne room experience. And so begins what scholars like to call bedroom diplomacy. Anne Boleyn effectively seduces the English monarchy into a total religious upheaval, not by offering her body, but by denying it. The more she resists, the more Henry craves her. The more he craves her, the more desperate he becomes to annul his marriage to Catherine. But the Pope says no, a political nightmare. Spain doesn't want its princess divorced. The Vatican won't condone it. So Henry does the unthinkable. He breaks from the Roman Catholic Church. He makes himself supreme head of the Church of England. And just like that, we have the English Reformation, all because a woman refused to sleep with a married king. Of course, Anne eventually gives in, after Henry secures the annulment, and marries her. The anticipation had been so intense. The actual wedding night was rumoured to be underwhelming. 9 months later, she gives birth. But it's a girl, Elizabeth. Not the son Henry was banking on. He tries again and again. She has miscarriages. His eyes start wandering. Anne begins to panic. She's known for her sharp tongue, her boldness, but in the royal court, boldness has a short shelf life, especially for women who fail to deliver sons. And this is where things get real dark. Henry accuses her of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Scholars still debate how much of this was fabricated. Some believe she was framed by political enemies. Others say Anne's flirtatious nature made the rumours easy to believe. One fringe theory that Henry, convinced by religious paranoia, truly believed Anne had bewitched him into loving her, and that her failure to produce a male heir proved God's disapproval. Anne is executed by sword, a merciful method compared to burning or axe. Henry marries Jane Seymour days later. Within weeks, the bed is warm again, and the court holds its breath. Here's your historical fact. Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church permanently altered the political, religious, and cultural landscape of England. His desire to annul his marriage didn't just hurt with feelings, it birthed an entirely new denomination. And your quirky fact? The Pope, in a last-ditch effort, did try to excommunicate Henry, but by then Henry had appointed his own bishops and didn't really care what Rome thought anymore. He had a new church and a new woman. As for the debate, historians still argue whether Henry truly believed he was divinely punished for his marriages, or whether he just used religion as a convenient excuse for his serial monogamy masquerading as moralism. Either way, you can't sleep on the reality that one man's sexual desperation fueled a schism so massive it still echoes today. Protestantism owes part of its momentum to a horny, frustrated monarch and a woman who knew how to keep her stockings on. And while Henry eventually got his son, Edward, it's the daughter from Anne Elizabeth I who would rule with more power, intelligence and style than any man Henry ever sired. Funny how history works like that. So let's stay exactly where we are. Same court, same king, same candlelit corridors where gossip travels faster than prayer. Only now you're walking in Anne Boleyn's shoes, and frankly, they're high, precarious, and coated in political venom. You've gone from flirtatious lady-in-waiting to Queen of England, and everyone is watching, especially the ones who hate you. Henry's obsession gave you a crown, but it's a crown lined with thorns. You're not just expected to bear an heir, you're expected to do it yesterday, and in between royal dinners, hunts, and those unsettling side-eyes from the clergy, you're supposed to keep the king aroused, loyal and obedient. Good luck with that. Anne's power didn't come from being docile or sweet. She was sharp-tongued, educated, and politically aware. She knew that controlling access to her body wasn't just moral, it was tactical. Before she was queen, she held Henry at bay for nearly 7 years, always out of reach, always teasing with letters, glances, and the occasional brush of a hand. It wasn't just seduction, it was statecraft. Every time she said no, she made herself more valuable and more dangerous. But once the chase ended, things shifted. Henry had what he wanted. Now he wanted something else. A son. And Anne. Well, Anne had Elizabeth. A girl. And the disappointment was loud both in Henry's silence and the whisper campaigns that started within days of the birth. But Anne wasn't about to go quietly. She fought, she argued with Henry in public. She got involved in court appointments. She even sparred with Thomas Cromwell, Henry's trusted advisor over foreign policy. Not smart in a court where power came from playing dumb. Behind closed doors, things were unravelling. Henry was already sniffing around Jane Seymour, a pale, obedient contrast to Anne's fire. Anne, now pregnant again, had every reason to feel desperate. And here comes one of the weirder, more tragic moments of her life. She miscarried a male fetus, supposedly on the very day Henry heard she might have been unfaithful. Did the stress trigger the miscarriage? Possibly. Did Henry take it as divine confirmation that she was cursed? Oh, absolutely. Now, enter the bedroom espionage. Anne had several male friends at court. Musicians, courtiers, and even her own brother, George Boleyn. Yes, you read that right. And when Henry wanted out of the marriage, Cromwell saw an opportunity. He orchestrated a web of charges so scandalous they shocked even the cutthroat Tudor elite. Adultery? Check. Treason? Naturally. Incest? That too. The trials were a circus, witnesses were tortured, evidence invented, and the verdicts delivered before the judges even put on their robes. Here's where things get messy. George Boleyn was accused of sleeping with his sister Anne. Why? Because their closeness unnerved people, and Cromwell knew how to weaponize closeness into corruption. Was there truth to it? No one credible believes it. But back then, the court didn't need truth. It needed closure, preferably with a blade. And Anne? She went to the scaffold with her back straight and her eyes open, still denying every accusation, even as the French swordsman raised his weapon. The public watched. The court cheered. Jane Seymour was moved into the king's rooms within days. And yet the sexual and political storm Anne created never really calmed. She changed the monarchy. She changed the church. And she taught every ambitious woman at court 2 hard lessons. Sex can get you a crown, and it can just as quickly take your head. Now for your historical fact. Anne Boleyn was the first Queen of England to be executed. Not divorced, not banished, beheaded. It set a dangerous precedent. Future queens would remember. And your quirky fact. During Anne's coronation procession, a falcon symbol, her personal emblem, was altered to appear with a crown. That was her signature move, turning soft symbols into power statements. As for the debate, historians still argue whether Anne was truly a political player or a pawn with excellent timing. Some see her as a proto-feminist icon. Others think she was simply a smart social climber who got in over her head. But here's what you know for sure. Anne's seduction wasn't just about sex, it was about power. It redefined what a woman could do in a world ruled by men. She didn't just sleep her way into history, she rewrote it. And as you drift further into this world of palace secrets, you can't help but think about all the stories that didn't get written down. The glances, the backroom promises, the silk robes and poisoned wine. Anne's tale is just one page in a book that's too dangerous to leave open on the table. But tonight, we're not closing it yet. There are more royal sheets to pull back, more whispered names to hear. And trust me, things are about to get much, much weirder. And now we float east, way east, beyond the foggy chaos of Tudor England into the cold, candlelit palaces of Imperial Russia, where luxury is measured in diamonds, and power is maintained through the sharp tip of a sabre or the stroke of a lover's hand. Welcome to the court of Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, and possibly the most unfairly slandered woman in all of European history. You've probably heard the horse rumour, everyone has, but tonight we're going to pull apart that strange little myth and see what was actually going on beneath the ermine-trimmed robes and the thick political layers of 18th century Russian rule. First things first, no, Catherine the Great did not die trying to have sex with a horse. She died of a stroke at the age of 67, but the story stuck, so why? Because when a woman seizes and holds absolute power in a patriarchal society, people get uncomfortable. And when that woman happens to have an active sex life, well, society doesn't just get uncomfortable, it gets vicious. So let's go back to the beginning. You're now a teenage German princess named Sophie, shipped off to Russia to marry the heir to the throne, Grand Duke Peter. You barely speak the language, but you're quick, bright, and terrifyingly ambitious. Peter, on the other hand, is, let's be generous and say he's emotionally stunted. He plays with toy soldiers and cuts bed. He hates women. He smells. And he seems more interested in military figurines than in actual romance. Or more to the point, actual royal duty. The marriage is cold, mechanical, and entirely sexless for nearly a decade. So, Sophie, now Catherine, does what many royal wives did to ensure dynastic survival. She takes a lover, or several, and thus begins one of history's most strategic and sensational sex lives. Catherine wasn't reckless. Every lover she took was carefully chosen, loyal, discreet, and usually politically useful. Some were military officers who brought her army support. Others were intellectuals who sharpened her already razor-sharp mind. And a few, well, they were just pretty. It's said that one of her advisors would inspect her potential lovers before she took them into her chambers, like a sort of pre-screening for virility and trustworthiness. Cold? Maybe, but effective? Oh, absolutely. Catherine had the unfortunate habit of outgrowing her lovers. When the passion fizzled or the politics shifted, she moved on. Sometimes with grace, sometimes with a generous pension and estate. Other times, not so much. But she never let her heart interfere with her rule. She expanded Russia's borders, reformed its legal system, and corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. She modernized a country while enjoying the private company of handsome men. And that, my friend, was unforgivable to her enemies. So back to the horse thing. This twisted rumour likely came from one of her many enemies at court or abroad, probably French, possibly British, definitely misogynistic. The myth was designed to be so grotesque, so unforgettable, that it would stain her legacy forever. And in some ways it worked. Ask any high school kid what they know about Catherine the Great, and 9 times out of 10, the horse will come up before the Enlightenment. It's a smear campaign that outlived empires. But here's a much more interesting detail. Her final favourite, Prince Platon Zubov, was 40 years younger than her. They met when she was in her 60s and he was in his 20s. She gave him wealth, titles, and influence. He gave her, well, probably very youthful company. The dynamic, scandalised Europe. A 60-something empress in love with a 20-something officer? Disgraceful. Unnatural. Never mind that kings had been doing it for centuries. Never mind that she was still running one of the largest empires in the world with ruthless efficiency. Let's give you the facts. Historically speaking, Catherine ruled longer than any other female monarch in Russian history. 34 years of power, war, diplomacy, and court intrigue. She transformed Russia into a major European power, and she did it without ever marrying again. Now, your quirky fact. When she died, Catherine's rooms were found to contain dozens of love letters, erotic drawings, and an impressive collection of, let's say, personal items, some carved from ivory, others from porcelains. Some historians believe these were gifts from lovers. Others think they were tools for a woman who knew exactly what she liked, with or without company. And your open debate. Scholars are still split on how much Catherine's personal life influenced her political decisions. Was she guided by love, lust, or calculated allianced bolting? Did her bedroom shape her empire, or did the empire simply give her freedom to live as she pleased? But here's something undeniable. Catherine's lovers were scandalous, not because she had them, but because she controlled the narrative. She chose. She decided when things began and ended. In a world where kings kept harems and mistresses by the dozen, Catherine flipped the script, and for that they called her monstrous. You watch her now, walking through the echoing halls of the Winter Palace, powdered, composed, and utterly unbothered by what the gossip says. She doesn't need anyone's approval. She writes her own legacy, one letter, one lover, one territory at a time, and if the price of power is a century or two of slander, well, so be it. From the frostbitten splendour of St. Petersburg, we now drift back to the balmier climes of France, where sex isn't scandalous, it's ceremonial. Welcome to Versailles, under the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, a man so obsessed with image, he had a mirror-lined hallway built just so people could admire him walking down it. You're in a palace of symmetry and satin, where court life isn't lived so much as performed, and where royal virility is less a private matter and more of a national broadcast. Louis XIV didn't just rule France. He embodied France. He was the original influencer centuries before TikTok or thirst traps, with a carefully constructed personal brand built on absolute power, impeccable fashion, and, crucially, a very public libido. His daily schedule was choreographed like ballet, and yes, that includes his erection. No, really. Each morning a crowd of nobles, some important, others just desperately hoping to be, gathered for what was called the levee, or the royal awakening. It was a ritual. They'd watch him open his eyes, get dressed, eat a few grapes, and if the mood was right, well, let's just say they took careful note of the king's health. A virile king meant a strong kingdom. A sluggish morning? Panic, whispered rumours, maybe even an astrological reading. The court hung on his every movement, and Louis knew it. He cultivated his image with extreme precision, and his sex life was no exception. His first queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, dutifully bore him 6 children, but it was the women outside the marriage who shaped Versailles. Chief among them was Madame de Montespan, a woman so enchanting she allegedly consulted with witches and dark magic to hold the king's attention. Rumours flew that she had a black mass said over her naked body to ensure his love. Whether or not that's true, spoiler, it's probably not. The fact that people believed it tells you how powerful she was. But Madame de Montespan wasn't just a pretty face. She became an unofficial queen, using her influence to secure titles, lands, and marriages for her allies. She had 7 children by her Louis, and each was legitimised, a massive move in a court obsessed with bloodlines. At one point she lived in an apartment above the Queen. You read that right. The mistress had real estate above the actual monarch. Versailles was built to make power visible. And the king's mistresses were often just as visible as his ministers. Now here's where things get delightfully strange. Louis didn't stop at one mistress. No, he had a full roster, and his court was expected to keep up. Gossip was constant. Whispers behind fans, furtive glances in gilded mirrors, the most salacious detail that Louis kept track of his performance in a private notebook. Dates, locations, how many times per day. One fringe theory, mostly discredited, claims his ministers even scheduled his bedroom activity for political advantage, knowing, for instance, that he might be more agreeable to land negotiations after a particularly successful night. But not everything was gold-leafed orgasms and candle-lit seductions. Montespan eventually fell from favour. The court was fickle, and as the king aged, his tastes shifted toward more pious companionship. Enter Madame de Maintenon, who possibly married him in secret after all that. The woman who once wrote racy plays ended up as his quiet spiritual companion. The mistresses became less sexy, more soothing. Fewer wild nights, more reflective walks in the garden, and then, of course, came the scandals. Montespan was named in the infamous Affair of the Poisons, a major witchcraft scandal involving actual potions, curses, and aristocrats getting a little too creative with their jealousy. Her enemies pounced. She was never officially charged, but the stink never quite lifted. And Louis, ever image-conscious, distanced himself. So what's the historical fact? Louis XIV ruled for over 72 years, making him the longest reigning monarch in European history. He expanded France's territory, centralised power, and built Versailles into the ultimate display of absolutism. Your quirky fact? The king's morning erections were genuinely discussed at court as a sign of royal health. There were records, observations, even speculation about fertility from astrologers. If he didn't perform, the kingdom worried. and the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Louis's mistresses had real political power or were simply symbolic. Were they chess pieces moved by the king, or were they moving pieces themselves? Regardless, you stand now at the gates of Versailles, watching as courtiers whisper into sleeves and mistresses glide across polished marble. It's a world where sex is not secret, but ceremonial, a tool of diplomacy, a measure of health, and a daily performance in the grand theatre of monarchy. And if you're thinking it sounds exhausting, you're not wrong, but it's also strangely intoxicating, this world, where seduction is policy, and silk sheets come with political agendas. Louis IV didn't hide his desires. He put them on display just like his mirrors, his wigs, and his wars, and somehow he got away with it. That's the power of branding, baby. You don't even have to leave Versailles. Just take a soft step down the hallway, past the golden doors and perfumed courtyards, and slip into the private chambers of another queen who made Europe collectively lose its mind, not through war or conquest, but through rumours, pamphlets, and a perfectly good pair of silk bloomers. Say hello to Marie Antoinette, Austrian by birth, French by marriage, and destined to become the single most scandalised woman in pre-revolutionary history. You're entering a world where lace is lethal, and sexuality isn't just politicised, it's weaponized. Marie was barely a teenager when she arrived in France, dragged from Vienna into the most unforgiving social fishbowl ever constructed. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a full-time surveillance machine, and Marie was its main exhibit. Every move she made was watched, dissected, and eventually exaggerated to absurd proportions. And the crown jewel of those exaggerations, the little thing the press liked to call the diamond necklace affair. But we'll get to that. First, let's address the bigger scandal. The one that had absolutely no basis in truth but somehow exploded into political dynamite. The accusation that Marie Antoinette had lesbian affairs. That's right. Among the many charges scribbled into underground pamphlets called libelles was the claim that the Queen spent her nights in bed not with her king, but with her female courtiers. It was whispered that she favoured her close friend the Princess de Lamballe and possibly the Duchesse de Polignac. These pamphlets didn't stop at implication. They went full fan fiction, detailed, filthy, illustrated. They described secret midnight meetings, coded caresses in the Queen's Hamlet, even sapphic orgies in candlelit corners of Versailles. Was any of it true? Almost certainly not. Marie may have been frivolous, perhaps even emotionally needy, but she wasn't the libertine they made her out to be. What she was, however, was politically isolated, unpopular with the French people, and dangerously foreign. And when you're a queen from Austria during a time when bread prices are climbing faster than your hairdo, people will say anything to bring you down, especially if you're gorgeous, out of touch, and, most unforgivable, fashionable. Let's talk about that image for a second. Marie Antoinette had taste. Her gowns were legend. Her hairstyles could house entire birds. She created a new genre of court fashion, le style gaulois, casual and breezy, with light muslins that clung in all the right places. Critics called it scandalous, practically underwear. But Marie didn't care. She was young, bored, and armed with the full budget of a monarchy. Her private estate, the Petit Trianon, became a world of escape, where she played milkmaid and frolicked in artificial farms, while outside the gates the poor were literally starving. You can imagine how well that went over. Now, back to the lesbian rumours. Why that angle? Because it was the perfect way to discredit her on every level. Homosexuality, especially female same-sex relationships, was considered both perverse and politically dangerous. The pamphlets didn't just suggest Marie was unfaithful, they framed her as morally unfit to rule, sexually degenerate and corrupting the very fabric of French womanhood. Throw in the fact that King Louis XVI had some performance issues, he didn't consummate the marriage for years, and suddenly every conspiracy had legs. Add to that the infamous diamond necklace affair, where a scam artist convinced Cardinal Rohan to buy a ludicrously expensive necklace under the false belief that Marie wanted it, and that she would pay him back in sexual favours. The Queen had nothing to do with the plot, but the scandal stuck. It was lurid, juicy, and deliciously classist. The idea of a foreign queen bankrupting France over diamonds and sapphic trysts. That story had legs, sequins, and fan art. So here's your historical fact. Marie Antoinette was a target of one of the most aggressive pre-revolutionary smear campaigns in European history. The libelles about her weren't isolated gossip. They were widespread, published, distributed like tabloids, and consumed by a furious, hungry public. Your quirky fact: the Princess de Lamballe, one of Marie's closest companions, was so beloved by the Queen that her death during the Revolution became a grotesque turning point. Her head was paraded on a pike beneath the Queen's prison window, just in case Marie had any remaining illusions about loyalty. In your scholarly debate, some historians argue that the libelous rumours were the real revolution, that the character assassination of Marie Antoinette played a more powerful role in the monarchy's fall than taxes, famine, or even the war. It wasn't just her fancies being critiqued, it was her body. So now you're sitting at her makeup table, powder brushes, perfume vials, hairpins like tiny daggers. You see her reflecting in the mirror, eyelids heavy, breath steady, but you can tell she knows they're watching, that her every gesture will be misread, that her friendships will be turned into orgies and her silks into weapons. But still, she lifts her chin, she smooths the bodice, she walks out back into the firestorm. Marie Antoinette never said let them eat cake, but she did say, "I was a queen and you took away my crown, a wife and you killed my husband, a mother and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains, take it, but do not make me suffer long." That's not a hedonist talking. That's a woman who was burned alive by public imagination. In the end, it wasn't sex that brought her down, but the stories people told about it. You blink once and the powdered wigs and poisoned pamphlets of Versailles dissolve into the stiff candle-scented air of another royal court, one ruled not by erotic scandal, but by the total and utter absence of sex. Or so they'd have you believe. Tonight, you find yourself standing behind the stiff skirts and alabaster mask of Queen Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. But don't be fooled. This woman didn't wear chastity like a virtue. She wielded it like a weapon. Every inch of her celibacy was curated, choreographed, and utterly calculated. Welcome to the bedroom of the Queen who claimed never to need one. Let's set the scene. It's mid-16th century England, and you're on a cold stone floor in Hampton Court. The Queen's chambers are silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of quill on parchment. Elizabeth is writing something, another speech, maybe a love letter that she'll never send, or perhaps just another strategic delay. She's not young anymore, but she's not old either. She's dressed like a thunderstorm, silver, black, wide-shouldered, terrifying, and everywhere you look there are eyes on her. Parliament wants her married. Her advisors want an heir. Europe wants an alliance. But Elizabeth wants power. And in her world, power means never crawling into someone else's bed. Not officially, anyway. Now here's the twist. Elizabeth was never truly alone. She was surrounded by men, ambassadors, poets, dukes, and especially Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Childhood friend, trusted companion, possibly more, maybe a lot more. He had the room next to hers. Their letters were flirty, intimate, coded with metaphors about storms and roses and fate. When his wife mysteriously fell down a flight of stairs and broke her neck, the court erupted. Did Elizabeth plan to marry him? Did she already share his bear? Or was she merely dangling the idea of marriage like bait, keeping every option just barely out of reach? You're watching this unfold, and it's impossible not to see the brilliance in her restraint. Elizabeth figured something out early that few others did. So long as she remained unmarried, she was the prize. No husband meant no foreign influence, no domestic power struggle, and no threat to her sovereignty. And by publicly preserving her virginity, she became more than just a queen. She became a symbol, the Virgin Queen, the mother of her nation. England itself wrapped up in a red wig and starched ruff. But the virgin thing? Let's take a breath there. No one really knows if Elizabeth died a virgin. She said she did, and official records support that image. No husband, no recognised children. But you have to remember, she lived in a time when men could sleep around and gain prestige, while women who did the same could lose their heads. Literally. So when Elizabeth flirted, when she kissed hands or allowed her favourites to whisper in her ear or brush her sleeve just a little too long, it wasn't romance, it was diplomacy. She had suitors from across Europe, kings, princes, dukes. For decades she strung them along like pearls on a necklace, never saying yes, never fully saying no. The French called her La Reine Vierge, with equal parts reverence and ridicule. But each time she declined a marriage proposal, she avoided a political trap. Marriage would have tied her to a faction, a foreign court, or worse, a man who thought he had the right to rule over her. Instead, she ruled alone, or rather, she ruled above, and yet the rumours never stopped. Her close physical bond with Dudley raised eyebrows. Her fondness for young, handsome courtiers like the dashing Earl of Essex kept the gossip mills grinding. There were whispers of nighttime visits, of secret staircases, of hands slipping beneath velvet bed curtains. Some modern historians argue she may have had at least one intimate relationship, but kept it so tightly under wraps that it never left a shadow. Others think it was all theatre, a lifelong performance of flirtation without consummation. Here's your historical fact. Elizabeth of Versailles reigned for 45 years, overseeing a period of remarkable stability and flourishing arts. Her decision to remain unmarried was unprecedented, and her calculated presentation of virginity became central to her political identity. Your quirky fact? In later life, Elizabeth wore thick layers of white lead makeup to cover her aging skin, so thick, in fact, that it's believed she essentially shellacked herself into a near statue. Even her intimacy was hidden behind inches of powder. And your scholarly debate? The question of whether Elizabeth truly remained celibate has divided biographers for centuries. Some say she was chaste, others say secretive, and a few say the virginity was pure myth spun for public consumption. What we can say is this: Elizabeth weaponized sex by abstaining from it. In a time when a woman's body was her only bargaining chip, she took it off the table and made herself untouchable. No mistress rumours, no royal bastards, just a queen in full command of her image and her country. You stand in her private chamber now, watching as she removes her wig, one pearl earring at a time. The transformation is stunning. The Iron Maiden becomes a fragile woman again, but only for a moment, only when no one's watching. And even then, you suspect she's performing for the walls, because once you build a kingdom on the idea that no man has ever touched you, it's a story you have to live forever. Slide quietly now out of the Elizabethan court, dusty, stern and hung heavy with unspoken desire, and follow the shadows north. We're stepping into the deeply uncomfortable corridors of Stuart England, where oil portraits watch you like they know your secrets, and the king's preferences don't quite match the mould history he was hoping for. Tonight, you're visiting the private life of King James III of England, James VI of Scotland if you want to get technical, a man who ruled 2 kingdoms, spoke fluent Latin, and very likely preferred the company of pretty young men over any queenly embrace. Let's just say, his royal bed was anything but straight. Now, when James took the English throne in 1603 after Elizabeth I finally vacated her crown in this world, England was desperate for continuity, stability and heirs. What they got instead was a shy, awkward, lisping king with a passion for books, theology, hunting, and, how shall we put this delicately, his male favourites. One in particular, Robert Carr, a dashing Scottish noble with excellent cheekbones and absolutely no experience in governance. James elevated him with a speed that made everyone blink twice. Within months, Robert was knighted, gifted titles, given land, and seen constantly at the king's side, or to be more precise, on the king's lap. At court, people murmured, then they gossiped, then they printed pamphlets. James didn't help. He wrote Carr letters so syrupy they practically stuck to your fingers. He called him my sweet child and wife, my heart's delight, and the one who rules my body and my thoughts. Not exactly the kind of phrasing you use for your political advisor, but let's not pretend this was an age of tolerant live and let love attitudes. This was 17th century England. Sodomy was a capital crime. Homosexuality wasn't just frowned upon, it was prosecuted. So James was walking a very dangerous tightrope. Yet somehow he didn't seem to care. He kept promoting Carr, even after the man bungled political duties and got tangled in a murder scandal involving poisoned tarts and a jealous wife. Seriously, it was a whole thing. Look up the Overbury affair if you want to lose sleep. Once Carr fell out of favour, James moved on to George Villiers, the future Duke of Buckingham. Now George wasn't just handsome, he was breathtaking, with dark curls, glowing skin, and a smile that could raise taxes. James adored him with an intensity that made even seasoned courtiers wince. He kissed him in public, he wrote sonnets. He said, "Christ had his John, and I have my George." No one could really pretend anymore. Was it romantic? Absolutely. Was it sexual? That's where scholars get itchy. There's no conclusive evidence of consummation. But come on, when a king writes dozens of letters calling a man his dearest spouse, gives him chambers next to his own, and spends hours alone with him each night. We are supposed to believe they just played chess. Please. James did marry to Anne of Denmark. They had children, he did his dynastic duty, but their relationship was distant. At one point they were living in separate palaces, and Anne reportedly refused to share his bed. Meanwhile, Villiers had his own rooms in the king's private quarters and sat closer to the throne than most of Parliament. Here's your historical fact. James I commissioned the King James Bible, arguably the most influential English-language text in history. He was also an intellectual and a patron of the arts, helping to kickstart the golden age of English literature. Your quirky fact. George Villiers, James's final favourite, was so closely tied to the king's image that people started calling him the Queen of England behind his back. It wasn't subtle, and your scholarly debate? The nature of James's relationships continues to be hotly contested. Some historians argue it was all platonic affection expressed in flowery early modern prose. Others, most, believe there was more behind those locked doors than poetry and prayer. You're standing now in a candlelit hall watching the young George lean in to whisper something into James's ear. The king chuckles softly, not because the joke is particularly funny, but because it's George telling it. Across the room, a few bishops stiffen. Parliament members look away. The Queen is nowhere to be seen, but James is perfectly content. He never denied his relationships, he just refused to explain them, and that in its own quiet way was revolutionary. In an age when sexual conformity was enforced with violence, James I lived a public life of affection that didn't match the rulebook. Maybe that's why he clung to men like George, not just for pleasure or companionship, but for the simple act of being himself, or at least the royal version of himself he could afford to be. So no, James wasn't the most charismatic king. He was awkward, prone to rambling speeches, and not exactly a fashion icon. But behind all that was a man who made his sexuality a part of his power, not a weakness to hide. And while he may not have marched through pride parades or waved rainbow flags, he left behind a legacy of quiet defiance, even if it was written in ink and whispers. From the soft lilt of James's whispered endearments and secretive courtly kisses, we now tumble directly into the loud, sweaty chaos of a very different kind of king. Meet Charles II, the Merry Monarch. And if you're picturing powdered wigs, wine, and a whole lot of women not wearing petticoats, congratulations. You've just stepped into Restoration England, and the court is practically vibrating with scandal. After a brutal civil war, years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, and more church than anyone really wanted, the English people were desperate for fun. And Charles delivered. With extra moaning, you're now walking the velvet-covered halls of Whitehall Palace, and every doorway leads to a new mistress, a secret passage, or a scandal in progress. There's music, gambling, backroom deals, and yes, sex everywhere. Charles had more mistresses than he had ministers. His court didn't even pretend to care. His private life was a national performance, and he didn't mind one bit. His motto might as well have been, if the kingdom's still standing and the bed's still warm, carry on. Let's meet a few of the leading ladies of this royal harem. There's Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, fiery, political, and spectacularly unfaithful, even while being the king's mistress. The two of them had several children together, all of whom were publicly acknowledged and showered with titles. Barbara wasn't just tolerated, she had an apartment in Whitehall, right next to the Queen's. You can't make that up. And Queen Catherine, she put up with it. She had no real choice. Then there was Nell Gwyn, a Cockney actress with a wicked tongue and a sharp mind. She started in London's theatres, back when women just began acting on stage, and ended up charming the king into more than just applause. She gave him 2 sons and became so beloved by the public that even her scandalous past couldn't taint her image. One famous Edo has her coach attacked by an angry mob who mistook her for a different mistress. Nell reportedly leaned out and shouted, "Good people, I am their Protestant whore," and the crowd let her pass with cheers. That's Restoration PR at its finest. And let's not forget Louise de Keroualle, the elegant French mistress who basically acted as a political agent for Louis XIV while warming Charles's bed. She was despised by the English for being Catholic, French, and slightly too perfect. But Charles adored her, and in true Restoration style made sure her pension was secure and her jewels abundant. Now you may be wondering how this worked logistically. Did he just rotate them? Was there a schedule? Actually, yes. Charles had what came to be called the bedchamber, a literal department, part bedroom, part backroom government, where decisions were made between sheets. Mistresses didn't just provide pleasure, they had influence. They whispered names into the king's ear. They brokered appointments. They passed letters. Some had their own factions within court, complete with spies, informants and stylists. Bedroom politics wasn't metaphorical, it was the actual method of governance. One of the more curious quirks of Charles's reign was his penchant for writing. He scribbled notes to his mistresses constantly, love letters, jokes, orders, and he kept a detailed account of his illegitimate children, whom he often ennobled. He once joked, "I'm the father of many children, and none of them legitimate," which, for the time, was less of a confession and more of a brand. Let's give you the stats. Charles II had at least 14 known illegitimate children, most of them with titles and estates. One of them, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, even tried to claim the throne after Charles's death, triggering a bloody rebellion. Here's your quirky fact. Charles was so open about his sex life that his court became known for what was essentially the first royal mistress track. Women literally came to court hoping to become royal mistresses because it was lucrative, high status, and often safer than a marriage into some obscure baron with bad teeth. And your scholarly debate? Historians remain divided on whether Charles's reign was weakened by his personal excesses or cleverly stabilised by his indulgences. Was he distracted from duty or disarming rebellion through decadence? You're now standing at the foot of the king's bed. Huge, canopied, probably still warm. The sheets smell faintly of roses, smoke, and last night's wine. There are letters on the pillow, and a slipper under the chair that definitely doesn't match any of the Queen's shoes. Courtiers come and go, trying not to look directly at the half-dressed lady slipping out through the side corridor. A page enters with a breakfast tray. 2 pieces of fruit, 3 letters from Parliament, and a note from Barbara that simply says, "Try harder tonight." And Charles? He's humming. What's wild is that this chaos didn't sink the monarchy. In fact, after Cromwell's stern, joyless regime, the public loved it. Charles brought back colour, art, laughter, decadence, yes, but also a sense that the country could breathe again. His sex life wasn't a liability, it was a symbol of freedom, or at least that's what the mistresses said. So if you're looking for the golden age of royal sexual freedom, here it is, Restoration England. One man, one crown, one rotating cast of lovers, and somehow it all just worked. Alright, buckle up, or better yet, loosen the corset, because we're staying in France tonight. And this time you're slipping into silk slippers and strolling straight into the boudoir of the woman who practically turned seduction into statecraft, Madame de Pompadour. Official mistress to Louis XV, she was more than just a pretty face lounging on a chaise longue. She was a strategist, an intellectual, a decorator, and yes, at times, the entire government. Her power didn't come from her body alone, but let's be honest, that certainly opened the door. You arrive in Versailles in the mid-18th century, where the palace has evolved into something both sacred and ridiculous, a gold-drenched fantasy built on protocol, pretense, and powdered wigs so big they might actually require scaffolding. Louis XV is no longer the charming young man France once adored. He's older now, moodier, and more inclined to hide away in his private hunting lodge than face the court. But Madame de Pompadour, she's still holding court, and not just in the salons. Her name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, which, yes, literally means fish. She was born into a bourgeois family, educated in art and philosophy, and given the finest grooming money could buy. Her mother took her to a fortune teller when she was 9, who said the girl would one day reign over the heart of a king, and Mum said, "Bet." From then on, Jeanne was trained like a royal missile: music, manners, literature, seduction. By the time she caught Louis's eye at a masked ball, the king never stood a chance. But here's what's fascinating. Pompadour only remained Louis's sexual mistress for about 5 years. After that, their physical relationship ended, but her influence did not. Instead of being cast aside like so many other discarded royal toys, she rebranded herself as his friend, his confidant, his advisor. The French called her maîtresse en titre, the official mistress. And let me tell you, no one has ever taken that job description more seriously. She moved into Versailles permanently, she decorated rooms, she curated royal art collections, she sponsored philosophers, and hosted salons for thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. She arranged royal marriages, promoted ministers, even advised on foreign policy. She was, for all intents and purposes, the prime minister in a corset, and while she may not have shared Louis's bed anymore, she managed every part of his life, including his subsequent mistresses, That's right. Madame de Pompadour selected the king's new playthings herself. She managed a rotating cast of young, beautiful women who were installed in the infamous Parc aux Cerfs, a private residence hidden behind Versailles, where Louis could indulge his appetites without involving the court or politics. Pompadour wasn't threatened by these girls. They were logistics. Now, about that Parc aux Cerfs, it was basically a royal brothel. Some girls were as young as 14. The public, already annoyed by the excessive spending of the monarchy, found out about the arrangement and went wild with anger. Pamphlets flew, the word debauchery got tossed around like wine at a banquet, and Pompadour, she took the blame, not because she was guilty, but because she was visible. Always has to be someone's fault, right? Here's your historical fact. Madame de Pompadour held her position at court for over 20 years, longer than any other royal mistress in French history. She wielded genuine political power, not just influence behind the scenes. Your quirky fact: she introduced the Rococo style to Versailles, championed porcelain manufacturing at Sèvres, and basically invented the French aesthetic you now see all over Pinterest. Oh, and the hairstyle. The iconic Pompadour, named after her, and the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Pompadour's hold on Louis XV was emotional genius, political brilliance, or simply the result of a king too lazy to replace her. Was she the love of his life, or just the best at reading the room? Whatever the case, you're in her quarters now, plush, scented, trimmed in pale blue and gold. She's writing a letter to Voltaire with one hand and brushing off a courtier with the other. She doesn't raise her voice, she never begs. Everything about her is calm, calculated, elegant. This is not a woman clinging to relevance, she is relevance. Louis sends word he'll be visiting later, not for intimacy, but to talk about a minister or a tax or a war. He still trusts her more than anyone. Because while the body may have stepped aside, the mind still reigns. Pompadour died at age 42, probably from tuberculosis, and the king wept. He didn't attend her funeral, that was considered improper for a monarch, but he kept her letters, her portraits, and her memory tucked close, and afterward he lost interest in politics entirely. The court shifted, the kingdom stumbled. It turns out she was doing more than anyone realised. So while history may love to remember mistresses as baubles and bedwarmers, Madame de Pompadour demands more. She used sex as an entry pass, sure, but what she built afterward was an empire of taste. Policy and power. She didn't seduce a king, she steered one. Now we leave the pastel silks and perfume diplomacy of Versailles and thunder straight into the mud-caked boots and bullet-scarred ego of one of history's most complicated megalomaniacs. Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, the guy with the hand in his coat, the funny hat, and the endless portraits staring off into middle distance like he's smelling something philosophical. Tonight, though, you're not meeting Napoleon the Conqueror. You're meeting Napoleon the man who was terrified of being laughed at in the bedroom, and who used sex as a tool of power, propaganda, and personal panic. Let's set the stage. It's the late 1790s, and France has just finished beheading most of its royal family and swapping powdered wigs for guillotines. Out of this chaos rises a Corsican general with a steel spine and a sharp mind, and he's moving fast. His victories in Italy and Egypt are legendary. The French are obsessed. He's got the army, the ambition, and soon the woman. That woman is Josephine de Beauharnais, an aristocratic widow with impeccable cheekbones, 2 children, and a reputation for being, shall we say, socially flexible. She's older than Napoleon by 6 years, has already survived a stint in prison during the Reign of Terror, and has a string of lovers in her past like pearls on a snap necklace. Napoleon falls for her hard. He writes her letters so intense they feel more like declarations of war than love. They're sweaty, pleading, full of dramatic longing and absolutely zero chill. One letter reads, "I awake full of you, the memory of last night, your kisses, your tears, your delicious jealousy." And then, 2 paragraphs later, "I shall be home in 5 days, stop washing." Yes, that's real. Napoleon was into musk. The man liked his women au naturel, possibly a side effect of years in military camps or a sign that hygiene wasn't yet trending in Paris. Either way, he wanted Josephine raw, emotional, and just a little ripe. Romantic, dubious, honest, painfully. They marry in 1796, but trouble begins immediately. Josephine cheats openly. While Napoleon's off conquering Italy, she's hosting lovers in their Paris home, and when he finds out, he's devastated. Not because he expected fidelity, let's be real. But because Josephine was supposed to be his anchor, her betrayal didn't just bruise his ego, it made him paranoid. In retaliation, Napoleon starts building his own reputation as a lover. He takes mistresses on the road. He has women in every city, every palace. He even develops a bizarre habit of pairing military movements with sexual conquests, as if he needed to win a bedroom before he could win a battlefield. And yet the shadow of Josephine remains. Despite everything, he keeps coming back to her. She becomes his emotional Achilles' heel. But the empire needs an heir, and after years of her marriage, Josephine hasn't produced one. Whether the fault lies with her or Napoleon is still debated, but either way, a decision is made. In 1810, Napoleon divorces her, not for lack of love, but for lack of utility. It's brutal. She weeps, he tells her, "I shall always love you, but my duty must come first," which, to be fair, is about the most romantic breakup line ever uttered by a future self-declared emperor. He marries Marie-Louise of Austria, who is 18, fertile, and absolutely terrified of him. She gives birth to a son within a year, and Napoleon finally gets his heir. He names the boy King of Rome and proceeds to parade him around like a victory flag. But emotionally, Napoleon is spent. He writes to Josephine. He visits her old estates. When she dies in 1814, just as his empire is crumbling, he collapses, and when he dies years later on the island of St. Helena, his last word isn't glory or France or victory, it's Josephine. Let's break it down. Your historical fact: Napoleon's marriage to Josephine was considered one of the earliest examples of a high-profile union driven more by passion than politics, at least at the start. It clashed with every expectation of the time, where leaders were supposed to marry strategically and love quietly. Your quirky fact: Napoleon was so fixated on Josephine's scent that he once delayed a military campaign just to surprise her at home, only to walk in on her in bed with another man. Oops! And your scholarly debate? Historians still argue whether Napoleon's relationship with Josephine was his greatest weakness, or his emotional engine. Did she distract him, ground him, humble him? Or was she just a beautifully dressed reminder that even emperors can't conquer love? You're standing now in Josephine's old bedroom at Malmaison, the country estate she filled with flowers, exotic animals and hand-painted ceilings. The bed is smaller than you'd expect, simple, private. You wonder how many tears were shed here, how many letters were composed, ink smeared with desperate hands. Napoleon's face is everywhere, in portraits, in busts, in little gold-framed miniatures on her dressing table. But Josephine's presence, that's in the air. Their story isn't one of grand romance, exactly. It's messier. It's about obsession and betrayal, and the way power turns people into monuments of insecurity. Napoleon ruled most of Europe for a time, but he could never quite rule her. And maybe that's what drove him. All the armies, all the titles, all the crowns, they couldn't replace the ache of one woman who wouldn't stay faithful, wouldn't submit, wouldn't love him the way he demanded. In the end, the emperor died not at the height of conquest, but in exile, whispering the name of the one person who truly conquered him. Now let's take a quieter, slower breath. Step out of the smoke-streaked halls of battle-scarred empires and into a world that seems, on the surface, prim, delicate, and oh so buttoned up. But don't be fooled by the lace gloves and mourning veils. Beneath Queen Victoria's tightly laced corset beats the heart of a woman who adored sex. Seriously, the Victorian era might be remembered for prudish etiquette, flower language, and covered piano legs, but Victoria herself? She was nothing short of thirsty for her husband. Tonight, we're peeking behind the black velvet curtain of the longest reigning 19th century monarch and her very, very active marital bed. You find yourself inside Buckingham Palace. The gas lamps cast a soft golden glow on thick damask drapes. Outside, the world is churning through industry, science, and empire. Inside, it's a little more personal. Queen Victoria is with Prince Albert, her cousin and her chosen partner, in ruling not just Britain, but her own wild emotions. Now, Victoria didn't have the most romantic upbringing. Her mother was controlling, her childhood was strict. She was crowned at 18 and surrounded by advisors who expected her to be obedient, ornamental, and ideally celibate. She wasn't having it. When Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha entered the picture, she fell, hard. She proposed to him, not the other way around, which was unheard of at the time, and once they married, well, The diaries say it all. Let's talk about those diaries. Victoria was a prolific writer, and she didn't hold back. Her journals are packed with references to Albert's body, his embrace, and the overwhelming physical joy she found in their union. One entry reads, "He clasped me in his arms, and we kissed again and again. His love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before." Another, "Oh, how I adore and love him. Oh, that I were near him once more." Not exactly subtle. She described their wedding night with such glowing sensual detail that it had to be edited by later royal archivists. Several historians believe entire volumes were destroyed or heavily redacted by her daughter Beatrice, who apparently didn't want the public knowing just how horny Mum really was. But we do know this: Victoria was obsessed with Albert. His body, his mind, his opinion on everything. Their marriage wasn't just romantic, it was wildly physical. And here's the kicker. While Victoria was championing morality in public, creating the image of the ideal British matron, raising 9 children and preaching family values, she was practically dragging Albert to the bedroom every chance she got. Even while pregnant, even when he was sick, even when he had other things to do, like, run an empire. Albert, to his credit, adored her too, but he was a more reserved, methodical type. He advised her, calmed her, handled policy behind the scenes, and probably got very little rest. The man had the aura of someone constantly recovering from enthusiastic royal affection. Their children? 9 in total. The palace was practically bursting at the seams with heirs, which only reinforced the Queen's image as a domestic goddess. But the truth is, she didn't particularly love children. She loved making them. Once born, she found them noisy, irritating, and generally in the way of Albert's attention. Then came the heartbreak. In 1861, Prince Albert died, likely from typhoid fever or Crohn's disease, though scholars still debate it. Victoria was shattered. She wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years. She stopped sleeping in their shared bed. She stopped participating in public life, and yet she didn't stop craving intimacy. She just redirected it. Enter John Brown, a rugged Scottish servant who was fiercely loyal and notably intimate with the Queen. He was unpolished, often drunk, and didn't bother with court niceties. Victoria loved it. She called him my dearest friend, gifted him medals, and was reportedly alone with him more than any of her ministers. There were rumours of a secret marriage, even more rumours about what went on in the secluded cottages at Balmoral. Historians still argue whether they were lovers, but the passion was obvious, and the nickname stuck. Mrs. Brown, the court whispered. After Brown's death, Victoria found comfort in yet another manservant, Abdul Karim, a young Indian attendant she promoted shockingly fast. She called him her munshi, or teacher, learned Urdu to communicate with him, and showered him with personal affection. He even shared her breakfast table, a privilege denied to most royals. Again, speculation swirled. Was this emotional neediness? Was it unrequited love? Was it just loneliness? Or did she crave connection in any form she could still get it? Let's roll the facts. Historically, Versailles. Queen Victoria redefined the image of female monarchy. Married, maternal, and morally upright. But in reality, she was a passionate, emotionally intense woman with a deeply physical love life and a tendency to fixate. Your quirky fact? Victoria commissioned a life-size marble sculpture of Albert in the nude. With drapery placed just so, she kept it in her private quarters, in mourning, for decades. And your scholarly debate? Whether Victoria's deep attachments after Albert's death were romantic, sexual, or simply obsessive is still a source of heated historical debate. Some argue she sublimated her sexuality into these close bonds. Others suggest she simply never stopped being the deeply sensual woman she'd always been. You're walking now through the halls of Windsor Castle. The portraits stare down at you. Victoria with her sombre expression, her many children arranged stiffly beside her. But in her eyes, you still see it. The fire, the longing, the woman who once scribbled about kisses and caresses is still there, even under all the black silk. Victorian morality was a national brand, exported globally, shaping generations. But the woman behind it, she knew love in its rawest, neediest form. She craved, she devoured, she mourned, and she never apologized for any of it, not even from the throne. Now leave behind the stiff collars and mourning veils of Victoria's court and fasten your gaze on her son, the man who practically burst out of the womb with a cigar in one hand and a mistress in the other. Tonight, you're strutting straight into the scandal-stuffed boudoirs of Edward VII, the original royal playboy, the man who lived more lavishly and loved more generously than any prince before him. If his mother represented duty, control and repression, Edward represented every single thing Victorian England tried to deny: sex, style, gluttony, gossip, and the absolute inability to keep it in his trousers. Let's set the stee. Edward was born into a family so bound by etiquette, even laughing too loudly could earn you a scolding. His mother, Queen Victoria, famously referred to sex as something too beastly to be spoken of. She expected her eldest son to follow the rules, be serious, be chaste, be the royal heir with a spine of iron and a heart of marble. Instead, Bertie, his nickname, became a full-time bon vivant. He gambled, he ate too much, he drank until his face turned the colour of his sash. And women? Oh, Edward adored women. He didn't just have affairs. He made a lifestyle out of them. Opera singers, actresses, aristocrats, if they were beautiful and daring, they were probably in his contact list. By the time he took the throne at age 59, he had already collected dozens of lovers and a reputation so scandalous that foreign ambassadors were instructed not to bring their wives anywhere near him. But among the harem of mistresses, one stands out like a glittering diamond: Alice Keppel. Sophisticated, politically astute and deeply charming, she became his long-term companion. She didn't just keep him warm at night, she kept him politically stable. Alice had a calming effect on the famously moody king, and was known to advise him discreetly on diplomatic matters. Sound familiar? She was, incidentally, the great-grandmother of Camilla, Queen Consort to King Charles III. Scandal has a way of circling back. Now let's talk about the chair. Not just any chair, the chair. Edward was such a regular visitor to a particular Parisian brothel, Le Chabanais, that they designed a custom sex chair to accommodate his, proportions and preferences. This wasn't a tasteful chaise lounge or some romantic fainting couch. This was a reinforced contraption that allowed for maximum versatility and minimum exertion. It even had special grips and a reclining option for when the king required support. You don't get a sex chair built for you unless you've achieved a certain reputation. And yet, Edward wasn't some reckless Lothario in a vacuum. He was the embodiment of a society desperate to exhale. After decades of Victorian prudishness, people wanted fun, excess and sparkle, and Edward gave them that. He hosted wild weekends at Sandringham. His dinner parties were famously long and opulent. 12 courses, 7 wines, multiple cigars, and never a dull story, and gossip thrived. Servants were sworn to secrecy. Guests were reminded not to bring their wives unless they were prepared to leave without them. His sexual appetite was legendary, but it came with an odd sense of consistency. He was discreet when he needed to be, generous to his mistresses, and never let his affairs interfere too openly with state affairs, though they certainly spiced them up. Unlike his mother, who saw sex as duty or danger, Edward treated it like part of being alive, necessary, enjoyable, strategic even. His charm made it seem like adultery was just polite conversation with better lighting. He also loved uniforms. Not just military ones, he had those in spades, but also elaborate silk dressing gowns, golden slippers, velvet robes embroidered with initials. Every affair was a costume drama, and Edward was always the star. Now for your historical fact, Edward VII had reigned for only 9 years, but during that time he modernised the monarchy, strengthened Britain's diplomatic ties, especially with France, and helped smooth the transition from the stiff Victorian age into something more glittering. What would later become the Edwardian era? Your quirky fact: that custom sex chair still exists. It's kept out of the public view in a private collection in Paris, and scholars have examined it, journalists have obsessed over it, and furniture historians, they blush just talking about it. And your scholarly debate. Historians still argue over whether Edward's sexual lifestyle damaged or humanised the monarchy. Was he a disgrace to royal dignity, or did he make kings seem relatable in a rapidly modernising world? You now find yourself in his private study, leather walls, cigar smoke lingering like a ghost, and the sound of distant laughter from a woman you're definitely not supposed to know is here. There's a love letter, half burned in the fireplace, a wine glass with lipstick on the rim, and under the desk, a slipper, not his size. Edward walks in, belly full, face ruddy, wearing a silk robe with a lion embroidered across the back. He sees you, smirks, and says, "Have you tried the claret? It's divine." And no, she's not staying the night. In his world, kings aren't remote icons. They're men, flawed, fun, dangerously alive. He didn't just break the rules, he made people want to live beyond them. So if Victoria was all about restraint and mourning, Edward was one long, extravagant exhale. And while history may raise an eyebrow, you can bet your last gold button he didn't lose sleep over it. If Edward VII was all velvet robes and cigar smoke, you're about to walk straight into something far more jagged, less pleasure palace, more psychological maze. Tonight we march into the marble and steel world of Kaiser Wilhelm II, last Emperor of Germany, and a man who may just be the perfect example of what happens when you mix unchecked power with deep, unresolved sexual insecurity. His kinks weren't as flamboyant as his British cousins, but Wilhelm's obsession with masculinity, domination, and appearances helped steer Europe straight into the meat grinder of World War I. All because, depending on who you ask, he never got over his left arm and a string of very peculiar fixations. So here we are in the Prussian court, surrounded by dark wood panelling, stiff uniforms, and enough medals to sink a battleship. Wilhelm II doesn't do softness, he doesn't do romance, he does power, and he does it loudly. But scratch the surface of this hyper-masculine performance and you'll find a man whose entire sexual identity was a bundle of contradictions wrapped in military braid. Let's start with the arm. Wilhelm was born with a severely damaged left arm due to a difficult breech birth. The limb was withered and nearly useless. His mother, Princess Victoria, daughter of the British Queen, was mortified. She saw it as a personal failure. Wilhelm was subjected to years of painful therapies, including being strapped into contraptions, electroshock treatments, and horse riding lessons meant to toughen him up. Spoiler alert, they didn't fix the arm, but they may have cracked something deeper inside. As he grew up, Wilhelm developed a neurotic obsession with projecting manliness. Not just strength, dominance. He loved uniforms. He wore up to 5 a day. He took an obsessive interest in military exercises, insisted on leading parades, and surrounded himself with statues, paintings, and literature that screamed testosterone. But his relationships? That's where things got weird. He married Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein, dutiful, devout, and very much there to produce children. And produce she did, 7 of them. But their marriage was never particularly passionate. Wilhelm didn't chase mistresses in the Edwardian way. Instead, his sexual life was channeled into performance. He needed to be seen as virile, strong, and commanding. He cultivated an image of what scholars have called hypersexualized masculinity. All muscle, no intimacy. Enter Philip zu Eulenburg, Wilhelm's closest friend and possibly his unrequited love interest. Eulenburg was a charming, sensitive aristocrat who became the Kaiser's most trusted advisor. They exchanged effusive letters full of emotional declarations that modern readers would definitely raise eyebrows at. Wilhelm called him his soul's twin. He leaned on him, trusted him, confided in him more than in anyone else. But in 1907, a scandal broke, the Harden-Eulenburg affair, where journalists accused Eulenburg and several others in Wilhelm's inner circle of being part of a secret gay cabal within the German government. Courtrooms were filled with testimony about cross-dressing, champagne-fueled garden parties, and coded letters. The accusations were partially true. Eulenburg was probably gay, but the real story was how violently Wilhelm turned on him. Overnight, Wilhelm cast him out. All affection, all sentimentality, gone. It was less about loyalty and more about the Emperor's horror at being implicated in anything resembling sexual ambiguity. The Kaiser couldn't stomach being perceived as weak, and in his mind, homosexuality is weakness. Never mind the letters, never mind the years of whispered devotion. The man who once declared Eulenburg his true heart now publicly denied him, all in the name of preserving his image. Here's your historical fact. The Eulenburg affair was the first major political sex scandal in modern German history. It exposed the hypocrisy of the court and permanently damaged the Kaiser's credibility, both domestically and abroad. Your quirky fact? Wilhelm collected statues of muscular men, Greco-Roman heroes, nude and sculpted. His private offices were filled with what can only be described as state-sanctioned thirst traps. It was classical art, yes, but the sheer volume of it raised questions even at the time. And your scholarly debate? Historians remain divided on Wilhelm's sexuality. Was he secretly queer and repressing it under layers of militarism? Or was he just emotionally stunted, using sexual projection to hide his inadequacy? There's no consensus, only a trail of broken friendships and one very confused legacy. By the time World War I erupts, Wilhelm is clinging to his image with white knuckles. He still insists on full military regalia, even as his generals make the real decisions. His speeches are full of sexualized language, penetration, domination, submission. He speaks of invading nations like they're lovers to be conquered. His enemies are feminized, his soldiers brothers in blood. It's a fantasy of masculine control, and it drives his actions in ways both tragic and absurd. You're now standing in his private study. The air is heavy with pipe smoke and ego. The walls are covered in hunting trophies and paintings of muscular heroes wrestling lions. A leather-bound volume of Plato's Symposium sits suspiciously worn on the shelf. There's a letter on the desk, half written, never sent. It begins, "My dearest Philip," and ends abruptly, the ink smeared. Outside, the world is preparing for war. Wilhelm adjusts his sash in the mirror for the 5th time this hour. He turns, inspecting himself from every angle. His left arm is tucked tightly into his coat, hidden as always. The performance continues. In the end, Wilhelm II's sex life may not have been scandalous in the traditional bed-hopping sense, but it was scandalous in its impact. His need to dominate, to control, to appear powerful created policies, alliances, and reactions that shaped a century. And behind it all, a damaged man who couldn't bear the thought that someone might see the weakness underneath the medals. You'd think after watching an emperor spiral into war over repressed desire and decorative muscle statues, we might get a break. Maybe a palace with some peace, a ruler with a decent therapist, a love story that ends in mutual respect. But no, this is royal history, and it doesn't do calm. Instead, we now slip into the candlelit melancholy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the drapes are heavy, the air is thick with incense, and one grief-stricken monarch clings to sexual obsession as a way to keep breathing. Welcome to the private world of Emperor Franz Joseph I, a man who ruled with iron routine by day and unravelled quietly behind velvet doors by night. You're in Vienna, late 19th century. The empire is massive, but it's fraying at the edges, an aging mosaic of languages, borders and resentments just waiting to explode. And at the centre sits Franz Joseph, the man everyone assumes is made of marble. He wakes at 4 a.m. every day, dresses the same way, eats the same boiled breakfast, signs documents with military precision. He is order incarnate, but inside he's haunted. It all begins and ends with Elizabeth. You may know her as Sisi, the Empress of Austria, a beauty so captivating she turned every head in Europe, including her cousin Franz Joseph's. He was supposed to marry her sister, but the moment he saw Sisi, everything changed. He fell hard and he got his way. She was 16, he was 23, they married in a frenzy of tiaras, waltzes and imperial expectations. But Sisi didn't want to be empress. She hated the court, hated the rules, hated her controlling mother-in-law. And while she did her royal duty, she bore children, wore the gowns, stood beside her husband. She did it all with a growing sense of suffocation. Eventually she fled, literally. She left court and travelled endlessly, writing poetry, riding horses, and refusing to eat more than the smallest sliver of fruit. She was anorexic, depressed, and desperately trying to reclaim a life that had never been hers. And Franz Joseph? He let her go. He loved her, but he loved her freedom too. Or maybe he was just too emotionally frozen to demand otherwise. Their relationship turned into a ghost story. Two people connected by grief and memory, rarely together, always aching. But Franz Joseph didn't stay alone. Enter Anna Nahowski, a middle-class woman with a tragic marriage and the kind of delicate beauty that caught imperial attention. Their affair began quietly. She was young, soft-spoken, and knew how to navigate a man who barely spoke his emotions aloud. For years, she and Franz Joseph met in secret. He paid for her home, he supported her children. They took walks, exchanged letters, shared long silences, comfortable ones. She was his quiet refuge. But here's where things get messy. While still seeing Anna, the emperor took another mistress, Katharina Schratt. Popular stage actress with a razor-sharp wit and, most importantly, the empress's blessing. Yes, you heard that right. Sisi actually encouraged the relationship. By then, she was done pretending to be Franz Joseph's partner, and she figured Katerina would at least keep him company. Whether that arrangement was sexual is still debated. Franz Joseph may have been emotionally intimate with Katerina while continuing his physical relationship with Anna, or vice versa. Either way, the emperor was balancing two women in the twilight of his life, neither of whom wore a crown, but both of whom wore his trust. Franz Joseph wasn't flamboyant. He wasn't scandalous in the Edwardian sense. But he was deeply bound to the women he loved, bound by ritual, by memory, by the need to feel something real in a world that demanded he always be composed. When Sisi was assassinated in 1898 by an Italian anarchist, wielding a sharpened file, Franz Joseph never recovered. He placed her portrait beside his bed, and it remained there until he died. For a man so emotionally closed, his grief was seismic. Here's your historical fact. Franz Joseph ruled the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 68 years, one of the longest reigns in European history. His strict sense of duty helped preserve the monarchy far longer than anyone expected, even as it teetered towards collapse. Your quirky fact. He was so punctual and disciplined that court staff set their clocks by him. His sexual escapades, while discreet, were often scheduled with the same military regularity. Tuesday and Friday afternoons were allegedly set aside for Anna, and the scholarly debate. Historians argue over whether Franz Joseph's relationships were emotionally driven or simply mechanical, a man using companionship as a coping mechanism, or someone quietly capable of deep, if fragmented, love. Now you're in his private sitting room at Schönbrunn Palace. The fire crackles, the wallpaper is a faded gold, and the ticking of the imperial clock is louder than it should be. On the table is a faded photograph of Sisi and still framed in silver. Beside it, a folded handkerchief embroidered with a monogram not belonging to the Empress. He sits in silence, reading the newspaper as if he's still expecting good news. But there is none. His empire is unravelling. His heir, Crown Prince Rudolph, died by suicide in a murder-suicide pact at Meierling with his teenage mistress. The court is in mourning again, and Franz Joseph, ever stoic, simply adjusts his collar and returns to his writing. He'll visit Anna tomorrow just for an hour, then a quiet supper with Katerina, then to bed alone beneath a portrait of the wife he could never truly hold on to. His love life wasn't about passion, it was about proximity to feeling, scraps of warmth in a kingdom of cold protocol. In the end, Franz Joseph didn't fall in love the way poets describe. He gravitated toward it, methodically, quietly, and with the aching intensity of a man who never learned how to speak his own heart aloud. If Franz Joseph lived inside a fortress of silence, carefully folding his sorrow into structured days, his distant cousin Nicholas II wore his emotions and his passion plain on his embroidered sleeve. Tonight, you slip through the gilded gates of Imperial Russia one last time, entering the doomed, dazzling, and often painfully tender world of the last Tsar and his one true love. Nicholas Romanov didn't have a harem, and he didn't have court-sanctioned affairs. What he had was Alexandra, and what they had, well, it was intense, erotic, codependent, and, as with so many royal romances, an emotional furnace burning against a world coming undone. You're walking now through the Winter Palace. Everything is heavy. The chandeliers are too large. The ceilings are too high. The ghosts of generations line the hallways in portraits, imperial, cold-eyed, crowned. And here's Nicholas, soft-featured, shy, far too gentle for the role he inherited. He was never supposed to be Tsar. His father, Alexander III, was the quintessential strongman ruler. Nicholas was the son who preferred flowers and poetry, the one who stammered in meetings and kept diaries full of, not political strategy, but emotional weather reports. And it's in those diaries that we find one of the most naked, unfiltered records of royal sex and sentimentality ever committed to ink. Nicholas didn't just write about treaties and military inspections. He wrote about his wife, his Alex, and not in the polite euphemisms you'd expect from a crowned head of state. His diary entries are blunt, endearing, and sometimes laugh-out-loud awkward. He wrote about when they made love, when she kissed his dear little nose, when they had a marvellous cuddle. Nearly every day he noted whether they had been intimate. And not just if, but how it made him feel. It was obsessive, really. Nicholas adored Alexandra with the zeal of a man who had very few people he could trust, and even fewer who made him feel powerful. She called him Nicky. He called her Sonny. Their letters were soaked in pet names, baby talk, and spiritual longing. At times, it reads more like a pair of teenagers playing house than the correspondence of an imperial couple ruling 1/6 of the earth. But under the cutesy language was a real erotic current. They wrote often about desire, about missing each other's touch, about nights spent tangled together in their private chambers while the weight of an empire simmered just beyond the walls. Alexandra, for her part, was no demure empress. Raised in Germany, deeply religious, and possessed of a stiff, often cold public demeanour, she melted only for Nicholas. She doted on him, clung to him, advised him, and in the bedroom? She gave as good as she got. Their letters don't shy away from passion. She described aching for him, dreaming of his hands, missing the feel of his lips on her skin, and unlike many monarchs, they were famously monogamous. No mistresses, no affairs, no sultry opera singers whisked through back corridors. It was just the two of them, deeply enmeshed, which sounds lovely, until you realise how dangerously isolated they became. Their emotional bubble grew airtight, sealed off from the real world, from their people, from politics, and then came Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin, the wandering mystic with a greasy beard, hypnotic eyes, and a reputation for both miracle healing and all-night orgies. When Nicholas and Alexandra's son, Alexei, was diagnosed with haemophilia, they were desperate. No heir, no future. Alexandra especially was frantic. She believed God had cursed them. Enter Rasputin, who somehow inexplicably could soothe the boy's bleeding fits. Alexandra became convinced he was sent by God. Nicholas, too exhausted to resist, allowed it. Soon Rasputin had access to their chambers, their secrets, even their schedules. And yes, the rumours were immediate. Was Rasputin sleeping with Alexandra? Was he seducing the Tsarina under the guise of holy healing? Most historians agree, probably not. But the perception was damaging. Erotic drawings, pornographic pamphlets, and satirical cartoons flooded the Russian underground press. They showed the Empress writhing under Rasputin, the children watching, the Tsar weeping. It was brutal, crude, and unforgettable. Suddenly their once private love life was a national joke, their loyalty seen as naivete, their passion as delusion. Here's your historical fact. Nicholas II's devotion to Alexandra blinded him politically. He ignored counsel, delayed reforms, and made decisions that fueled the revolution, all in part to protect her and their vision of a sacred, divinely sanctioned monarchy. Your quirky fact? Nicholas's diary entries about sex were so specific, some biographers published tables categorizing how many times he and Alexandra were intimate each month. March 1904, for example, showed a dramatic dip, presumably due to political unrest, or a cold. And your scholarly debate. Scholars argue whether their devotion was a strength or a fatal weakness. Did their monogamy and their emotional intimacy give them resilience, or did it create an echo chamber that blinded them to the world burning outside the palace gates? You're standing now in their private room at the Alexander Palace. It's modest, surprisingly so. Floral curtains, family portraits, a worn crib in the corner. On the bedside table, a small leather-bound diary, its pages curled at the edges. If you flip it open, today's entry reads simply, "Sat with Sunny in the garden, a quiet joy, a kiss." Later in bed, more kisses. The world feels far away. But the world wasn't far away. It was waiting at the gates with rifles and red banners. Their love was real. Their passion, genuine. But in the end, love wasn't enough. The revolution didn't care how many times they kissed, or how faithfully they remained each other's only. When the Romanovs were lined up in that basement in 1918, there were no letters, no silk sheets, only bullets. History rarely gives you clean transitions, but here's one that feels like a door slamming and a jazz record starting. From the echoing deaths of the Romanovs, we pivot sharply to the most infamous love story of abdication, exile, and whispered sexual legend in modern royal history. Yes, you already know the headlines. Tonight, we step into the bedroom politics of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, a relationship so controversial, so sexually charged, and so scandal-laced, it cracked the British monarchy wide open. What most people forget, this was never just about love. It was about power, obsession, image, and sex, or rather the idea of it. You're now in 1930s London, a city pulsing with jazz, champagne, and the slow unravelling of an empire. Edward is the Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, and a man whose entire personality is summed up by one word: rebellious. He's dashing, fashionable, and utterly bored by the crusty rituals of royal life. He hates court functions, hates the press, hates being told what to do, and then he meets Wallace. Wallace Warfield Simpson, American, divorced once, married again. Politically outspoken, deeply stylish, and sharp enough to cut steel with her voice alone. When she walks into a room, she doesn't flirt. She commands. She doesn't beg for attention, she dares you not to give it. For a man like Edward, emotionally needy, easily swayed, forever seeking validation, Wallace wasn't just intriguing. She was electric. They begin an affair while she's still married to her second husband. Everyone around Edward is horrified. The monarchy isn't just about titles, it's about image, continuity, and the illusion of moral superiority. A future king consorting with a twice-divorced American? That wasn't love, it was national collapse in slow motion. But Edward doesn't care. He grows more obsessed by the day. The more resistance he meets, from family, from government, from the press, the more he digs in. So what was it about Wallace? Yes, she was witty, stylish, unapologetically modern. But beneath the charm was a rumour that still echoes through every history book, that Wallace had certain bedroom talents. One version called it Oriental techniques she allegedly picked up during her first marriage in China. Another claimed she'd mastered forms of pleasure that made Edward, how shall we say this, pliable. Royal biographers have danced awkwardly around this for decades, always hinting, rarely confirming. But the implication has always lingered, that Edward's passion for Wallace wasn't just romantic or emotional, it was erotic, addictive, something he couldn't get elsewhere. And while we'll never know exactly what happened behind those closed doors, what we do know is that Edward began to behave less like a prince and more like a besotted teenager. He wrote her letters almost daily, breathless, clingy, borderline worshipful. He sent her jewellery, silk underthings, entire wardrobes. He even allowed her to mock him in private. There was power in that. Edward had grown up in a world of strict rules and constant performance. Wallace was the only person who treated him like a flawed man, and somehow that made her irresistible. By the time his father, King George V, died in 1936, Edward was king in name, but emotionally. Wallace was wearing the crown. She was still technically married, the government was losing its mind, and the new monarch was already planning their life together. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Parliament, and even Winston Churchill tried to intervene. Couldn't she just go away? Couldn't he just be discreet? Edward gave his answer by doing what no British monarch had ever done. He abdicated. He gave up the throne for her. For a woman he wasn't even allowed to marry as king. The speech he delivered to the nation was famous for one line: "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." Romantic? Sure. But buried beneath that poetic phrasing was the truth. He gave up everything for her. The crown, his country, his family, all for Wallace. Here's your historical fact. Edward VIII's abdication marked the first time in British history that a monarch voluntarily gave up the throne due to personal choice, not war or death. His decision altered the line of succession and made his younger brother, George VI, king, and in time paved the way for Queen Elizabeth II. Your quirky fact: Edward had Wallace's image painted on the inside of his cigarette case. She was literally pressed against his lips every day, and they designed monograms for themselves that fused their initials like teenage sweethearts. And your scholarly debate? Historians remain sharply divided. Was this the greatest love story of the 20th century, or was it a tale of manipulation, emotional dependency, and dangerous selfishness? Some argue Wallace never loved Edward as much as the life he gave her. Others say Edward, emotionally underdeveloped and desperate for love, never stood a chance against someone like her. You're sitting now in the Villa Windsor in Paris, where the exiled couple lived out their days. The furniture is tasteful, the staff discreet, and the rooms heavy with everything not said. A photo of Wallace in a satin gown leans against the mirror. Edward's dressing robe still hangs on the back of the door. They were always photographed together, always polished, always posing. But there's something missing. Power, influence, relevance. The irony: Edward gave up the world for Wallace, but in doing so lost the one thing that made him special. Without the crown, he became a man with nothing left to offer but attention. Wallace stayed with him, yes, but whether out of love, loyalty, or obligation, no one can say for sure. She once famously remarked, "You have no idea how hard it is to live with a man who's given up everything for you." Maybe love did win, maybe sex won, or maybe neither did. From royal abdication and erotic myth-making, we fast-forward into the smoky parlours and Caribbean beaches of mid-20th century aristocratic rebellion, where tiaras start slipping, cocktails replace protocol, and one princess decides that if she can't have the throne, she'll at least have the thrill. Tonight, we're draped in chiffon, riding cigarette boats, and dancing barefoot into the scandalous nights of Princess Margaret, sister to a queen, subject of tabloids and woman of very particular appetites. She was the royal who smoked too much, drank too early, and absolutely did not care if you disapproved. Margaret was born into duty but never destined to rule. Her older sister Elizabeth would take the crown. Margaret, she got the spare bedroom and a front row seat to centuries of royal restriction. She was clever, talented, devastatingly witty, and completely uninterested in the idea of behaving from her teenage years. She partied harder than anyone else in the royal family, and once her father, King George VI, died, and Elizabeth became queen, Margaret's rebellion kicked into high gear. At first, her love life was tragic. She fell deeply in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a war hero dashing and decorated. But divorced, that was the problem. In the new 50s, divorce was still a four-letter word in royal circles. Margaret wanted to marry him, the press wanted it, the public loved the idea, but the church said no. Parliament hesitated. Elizabeth, caught between her sister and her title, couldn't approve it without igniting a constitutional fire. So in a highly publicised heartbreak, Margaret gave up Townsend. Or at least that's the official line. Some say she was pressured, others say she simply got bored. Whatever the truth, something shifted. Margaret hardened. She traded courtship for conquest. From that point on, she lived as if tradition had already buried her and was just waiting for the funeral. Cue the art scene, cue the musicians, cue the bohemian beach parties with men wearing only gold chains and bad decisions. Her most infamous relationship, that would be with Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, a photographer with a reputation for being impossibly charming, socially slippery and sexually adventurous. He moved through London's fashion and art circles like a fox in a cocktail bar. They met during a photo shoot. He captured her not as a princess, but as a woman, vulnerable, wild-eyed, beautiful. She was hooked. They married in 1960, the first royal wedding ever televised, drawing over 300 million viewers. The world thought it was a fairy tale. It wasn't. Within months, the cracks showed. Snowdon had no interest in royal life. He stayed up late with artists and actors, threw explosive fits, and allegedly kept a list of sexual partners in code, written inside a hollowed-out book. Margaret, meanwhile, demanded attention, affection, and glamour. She lit up parties but could be cutting and cold the next morning. Their fights were volcanic. Their reconciliations were grand, and their affairs, frequent, spectacular, public. Margaret's lovers ranged from aristocrats to commoners, artists to actors. One of the most scandalous entanglements involved a much younger man named Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener with an unfortunate perm and a charming smile. He was 17 years her junior, and when paparazzi photos emerged of them sunbathing on the Caribbean island of Mustique, Margaret in a swimsuit, Roddy in barely anything, had ignited a full-blown tabloid firestorm. The press branded her a cougar. The palace went silent. The public devoured every pixel of her tan. But here's the thing. Margaret didn't apologise, she didn't explain. She never once tried to reframe herself as a victim or martyr. If anything, she leaned in. She smoked through scandals, she smirked through headlines. She wore backless gowns and lit cigarettes with one lover's match while watching another across the room. Royal protocol dictated modesty. Margaret dictated the guest list. Here's your historical fact. Margaret was the first royal in Pompadour's centuries to openly and unapologetically engage in affairs while maintaining her royal title. Her divorce from Lord Snowdon in 1978 was the first royal split since Henry VIII, if you don't count the decapitation. Your quirky fact? Margaret once posed semi-nude for a private portrait by her then-husband, wearing nothing but a tiara and pearls. The photo was kept hidden for decades and later caused a scandal all over again when it resurfaced in exhibitions. And your scholarly debate? Historians argue whether Margaret was a rebel or a prisoner. Was she breaking the rules out of genuine defiance or acting out because the palace had no room for a powerful woman without a crown? Was she free or just desperately carving out an identity beneath the royal ceiling? You're standing now in her private salon at Kensington Palace. Velvet cushions, empty glasses, the faint scent of French perfume and stale smoke. A grand piano sits in the corner, silent. On the coffee table, a book of poetry, a lipstick-stained wine glass, and a crumpled note that simply reads, "Be wicked. Be bold." There's music playing from a record in the other room, Billie Holiday maybe, or some old jazz standard Margaret loved. You can almost see her there, barefoot, wine in one hand, rolling her eyes at anyone who dares bring up tradition. The woman could sing, the woman could charm, but above all the woman lived. Princess Margaret didn't bring down the monarchy. She cracked it open, made it human, made it sweat, and while the press would never let her forget her indiscretions, the public never stopped watching, or secretly admiring. Because if you're not going to rule the world, you might as well set fire to the palace. Now drift southward, just a bit, just far enough that the stiff upper lips of British royalty melt into Mediterranean sun and old world indulgence. Welcome to the Spanish monarchy, a place where scandals aren't whispered, they're documented, tallied, and sometimes even banked in Swiss accounts. Tonight, we slip behind the gilded doors of Spain's modern monarchy to meet the man who once wore the crown and apparently took Viva la Vida as more of a personal mission statement than a national sentiment. You're now entering the world of King Juan Carlos V. And oh, what a world it is. Let's get something clear from the start. Juan Carlos wasn't born to rule a scandal. He was born into exile, groomed in Franco's Spain, and handed a monarchy on the condition that he'd keep it politically ornamental. Instead, he did something shocking. He helped steer Spain toward democracy after Franco's death. The man became a national hero. And for a while, everyone politely ignored the fact that he was also a professional seducer with a rumoured lover list that reads like a deleted tab in someone's browser history. How many lovers did he have? Well, according to one intelligence report, yes, a real one, Juan Carlos allegedly bedded over 5,000 women. 5,000. That's not just excessive, that's logistics, that's infrastructure. And while those numbers are almost certainly inflated, there's no doubt that his romantic life was as vigorous as it was discreet, at least for a while. His official wife, Queen Sophia, a Greek princess with steely poise and tragic eyes, bore it all in silence. They married in 62 and quickly produced heirs, but after that, let's just say Sophia became less of a queen and more of a backdrop. She travelled separately, slept in separate quarters, and if she ever complained about her husband's wandering hands and other parts, it never reached the public record. The Spanish press, much like the British tabloids once did, practiced a kind of unspoken censorship. The king was untouchable, but times change, the internet exists, and eventually so did Corinna Larson. Corinna, blonde, German-born Danish, twice divorced and fluent in several languages, met Juan Carlos in the early 2000s at a hunting party. Because of course it was a hunting party, she was glamorous, connected, and very comfortable around power. He fell hard, so hard in fact, that he reportedly called her his true companion. They travelled together extensively and she wasn't exactly hiding. Spanish journalists noticed her at official events. Paparazzi photos caught her entering hotels under pseudonyms. Whispers turned into full-blown media waves. And then came the money. In 2012, Juan Carlos went on a secret elephant hunting trip to Botswana. This was while Spain was deep in a financial crisis, with unemployment surging and austerity measures cutting into public services. The images that surfaced were explosive. Juan Carlos, grinning beside a dead elephant, expensive rifle in hand, luxury gear all around. Who organised the trip? Corinna. Who paid for it? That's the part that unravelled everything. It was discovered that Juan Carlos had been moving huge sums of money through offshore accounts. We're talking hundreds of millions, some of it traced back to a suspicious $100 million gift from Saudi Arabia. A portion of that went to Corinna via a Swiss bank. When asked about it, she said it was simply a token of his affection, a token that came with financial advisors and shell companies. And here's where the once heroic monarch began to publicly fall. What had been bedroom whispers were now international headlines. Spain was no longer amused. The monarchy, long teetering on the edge of public relevance, was being dragged through the mud by a man who had once symbolised its rebirth. His own son, Felipe VI, began severing ties. The royal household distanced itself, and in 2014, Juan Carlos abdicated. But even that wasn't the end. In 2020, as investigations into financial misconduct grew, Juan Carlos fled Spain altogether, just left. He moved to Abu Dhabi, living in quiet, expensive exile, while the Spanish public asked the question, how did the man who brought democracy also bring this disaster? Here's your historical fact. Juan Carlos played a critical role in the peaceful transition from Franco's dictatorship to parliamentary democracy, even standing up to a military coup attempt in 1981. For that, he was celebrated. Deservedly so. Your quirky fact? Corinna once claimed the king had a delightful sense of humour and liked to text her flirty messages full of emojis. Yes, emojis. From a king. And your scholarly debate? Historians now wrestle with how to balance Juan Carlos's early heroism with his late-life scandals. Is his legacy defined by democracy or debauchery? Was his fall inevitable in a world where royal immunity no longer exists? You're standing now in a quiet villa somewhere in the UAE. The view is all desert and silence. Inside there's marble, soft slippers, and the occasional thud of a golf ball against the tile. Juan Carlos is older now, slower, but he still reads the news. He knows what they say. On the wall behind him is a photo of him in his younger days, regal, respected, surrounded by generals, and tucked beneath it, a smaller frame, Corinna smiling in a white dress. Not a royal portrait, but something far more dangerous. Because what do you do when the country you saved turns its back on you? You remember, the women, the letters, the heat, the years when the world said yes, and you never learned how to hear no. Now, lean in. We're heading into darker territory. A place where sexual whispers don't just ripple through royal halls, but twist into something heavier, something laced with paranoia, mystery, and tragedy. You've arrived in late Victorian London, deep in the gaslit alleyways and creaking floorboards of one of the most enduring and unnerving royal sex scandals ever whispered, the tale of Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the man who should have been king, but instead became a ghost, a rumour, and, if some are to be believed, a suspect in the most infamous unsolved murder case in British history. So let's pull back the curtain on this forgotten prince. Albert Victor, Eddie to his family, was the eldest son of Edward VII and the grandson of Queen Victoria. From the moment he was born, he was second in line to the throne. But if Edward was all charm and vice, and Victoria was all control and duty, Eddie was awkward, shy, delicate, handsome in a pale, soft-focus way, and not particularly sharp. Tutors complained he was slow, unmotivated. The kind of royal child who might have fared better as a minor aristocrat rather than a future sovereign. Still, being heir meant visibility, and visibility meant scrutiny. By the time Eddie was in his 20s, rumours about his sexuality were already circulating. Some were typical Victorian homophobia wrapped in classist panic, others were specific. In 1889, a male brothel in Cleveland Street was raided by police. It catered to wealthy gentlemen, some of whom were clients from elite circles. Names began to surface, powerful names, and while there's no hard evidence linking Eddie to the brothel, a certain hush-hushness fell over the entire investigation when whispers placed his name in the client ledger. The court moved quickly, records were sealed, accusations dismissed, newspapers threatened into silence, and while no charges were ever filed, the stink of scandal stuck. Was it true? Historians are split. Some claim the connection was fabricated by Republicans and anti-royalists. Others argue it was real, and carefully erased. Either way, Eddie's reputation took a blow, and it didn't stop there, because in 1888, the Whitechapel district of London became the hunting ground of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper murders, grisly, brutal, surgical, sent shockwaves through Victorian society. Prostitutes dismembered in alleyways, police baffled, the press ravenous, and amid the frenzy, one name started appearing in underground whispers: Prince Albert Victor. Why him? Why would the heir to the throne be connected to a serial killer? Well, here's where it gets completely unhinged. One theory, pushed by conspiracy writers and a few rogue journalists, suggested Eddie had secretly married a working-class girl, had a child with her, and the Crown was desperate to hide it. The Ripper killings, they claimed, were assassinations, women who knew too much, silenced by agents of the royal family. In this version, Eddie wasn't the killer, he was the reason for the cover-up. Another, more fringe theory? That he was the Ripper himself. that his supposed madness, degenerative illness, or repressed sexuality led him into violent outbursts. This theory has been widely debunked. Eddie had alibis for several of the murders, but it still persists in the public imagination. The idea of a royal turning predator is too irresistible for history to fully abandon. What we do know is that Eddie's health was always fragile, both mentally and physically. He suffered from respiratory issues, possibly epilepsy, and maybe even undiagnosed mental illness. His mother doted on him. His father seemed perplexed. The public, uneasy. In an effort to shore up his image, the palace tried to arrange a respectable marriage. In 1891, he became engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, a quiet, dignified woman who would eventually marry his younger brother, the future George V. But Eddie didn't make it to the altar. He died in 1892, at just 28 years old from pneumonia during a flu pandemic. His death was sudden, shocking, and immediately mythologized. A tragic prince, a misunderstood man, a royal enigma buried beneath Westminster Abbey, and layers of suspicion. Here's your historical fact. Prince Albert Victor was genuinely next in line to the British throne. Had he lived, he would have become king, not his younger brother George V. The entire shape of the modern royal family would look different. Your quirky fact. In his youth, Eddie travelled extensively through India and the Far East, where rumours claimed he picked up exotic tastes and was involved in at least one very compromising incident involving a local dignitary's son and a scandalous painting. And your scholarly debate? To this day, biographers and royal historians debate whether Eddie was gay, bisexual, asexual, or simply socially awkward. Was he a gentle soul who got caught in the machine of monarchy? Or was there something darker that never made it into the official record? You're now standing in his old quarters at Sandringham. The curtains are drawn. A small painting of the Virgin Mary hangs over the bed. Eddie was famously devout, or at least liked to appear so. On the desk, a half-written letter, a pipe, and a monogrammed hairbrush. The silence is deep, unsettling. You get the sense that something here was never resolved, that his story wasn't just cut short, but intentionally buried. Maybe he was just a fragile man, out of place in a brutal age. Maybe he was more dangerous than we'll ever know, but the fact that over a century later people are still telling stories about his secret life says something. Not about Eddie, perhaps, but about us. Our obsession with what royals do when no one's watching. Our need to believe that behind the crown lies something unholy, or something human. Step out of the fog-drenched alleys of Victorian London and into the filtered flashbulb frenzy of Monaco, where diamonds sparkle like scandal, and every hotel suite comes with its own set of secrets. Tonight, we're trading shadowy rumours for spotlight obsession, press passes, blackmail folders, and lipstick traces on the sheets. You've arrived in the sun-bleached, camera-blinded world of Grace Kelly, the Hollywood icon turned Princess of Monaco, whose beauty launched 1,000 headlines, and whose hidden affairs still swirl beneath the polished veneer of royal fairy tale. Let's be honest, Grace Kelly was never just a pretty face. She was cinematic perfection, ice-blonde, soft-spoken, and eternally poised. Directors called her aloof, audiences called her divine, and the men around her? Well, they didn't call, they begged. She had affairs with many of her leading men, Clark Gable, Ray Milland, William Holden, and even a brief entanglement with Prince Rainier's soon-to-be best man, which you'll want to remember later. On screen, she was chaste and elegant. Off-screen, quite a bit more complicated. By 1955, she was 30, acclaimed and already bored with Hollywood's limitations. That's when she was introduced to Prince Rainier III, ruler of a small, glitzy, financially precarious country nestled on the French Riviera. The meeting was arranged as a publicity stunt. Yes, really, during the Cannes Film Festival. A photo op at the palace. But what began as a staged encounter turned into a whirlwind courtship, and by 1956, the wedding of Grace and Rainier was the biggest event since Elizabeth's coronation. But here's what didn't make it into the fairy tale footage. Grace was pregnant before the wedding. Or depending on who you believe, she was either already expecting or had recently suffered a miscarriage. Her studio, MGM, panicked. They had invested heavily in her image as the pure, untouchable starlet, and now she was engaged to a foreign prince with a very real sex life. The press was muzzled, her contract was quietly dissolved, and her transformation from actress to princess was fast-tracked with the urgency of a royal pregnancy test. Her wedding dress, designed to emphasize modesty, was basically armor, Lace high to the chin, sleeves down to the wrists, gloves, veil, crown, and she looked like a saint walking into a Disney castle, but her pumped eyes told another story. One of someone walking into a cage she had built herself. The marriage began with public smiles and private friction. Rainier, for all his charm, was not the carefree prince of Hollywood daydreams. He was cold, controlling, traditional in the least fun sense, and, by most accounts, not particularly faithful. He reportedly kept mistresses, some of them for years. Grace, once a woman courted by the most powerful men in the world, was suddenly bound by royal protocol that barely allowed her to sneeze without permission. So she rebelled, but quietly, discreetly, with the precision of someone who'd spent her life dodging paparazzi and memorizing script lines. Her most whispered-about affair? With Oleg Cassini, the fashion designer who dressed Jackie Kennedy and reportedly stayed in contact with Grace long after her marriage. Another rumoured lover, Frank Sinatra, her co-star and longtime friend, whose private jet made a few suspiciously timed visits to Europe in the early 60s. But there was also the suggestion of blackmail, not against Grace, but by Grace. According to the several palace insiders and a few well-informed journalists, she kept a dossier, a literal folder full of documentation, letters, photographs, receipts, on her husband's infidelities and business dealings. Insurance, they said. If things ever went sideways, she'd walk and take the whole monarchy down with her. And then there's the friendship-turned intimacy that has fascinated biographers for decades. Grace and her priest. Yes, her priest. A Jesuit advisor with whom she exchanged long emotional letters, often signed yours in every way. One letter, never officially confirmed but widely believed to be real, included the line, "I think of you when I cannot sleep. I think of you in ways I cannot say aloud." Was it spiritual longing, emotional dependency, or a cloaked affair hidden in faith's vocabulary? The church denies it, biographers disagree, but the letters disappeared after her death, gone, like so many fragments of the real Grace. Here's your historical fact. Grace Kelly's marriage to Rainier III transformed Monaco from a sleepy tax haven into a global luxury brand. She helped rescue the principality from financial ruin with her fame alone. Your quirky fact? Rainier reportedly had Grace's bedroom painted in a darker colour because he thought the original shade of pale blue made her look too cold. Which, if you've seen her films, feels less like an aesthetic decision and more like a cry for control. And your scholarly debate? The biggest question remains. Was Grace a tragic figure, a woman sacrificed to the image of monarchy? Or was she a quiet power player, managing her own affairs while maintaining a facade so polished it still blinds historians? You're now in a guest room at the Royal Palace in Monaco. It's quiet. The walls are cream-coloured and thickly insulated. There's a vanity with a hairbrush, a faded Chanel perfume bottle, and a crystal ashtray. You can hear the soft lapping of the sea below, and on the bed, a stack of monogrammed stationery. No letters, just blank pages. Because Grace didn't leave confessions, she left gaps, spaces where the truth might live, if anyone ever dares to fill them. In 1982 she died after suffering a stroke while driving on a mountain road. Her car plunged off the edge. Her daughter was in the passenger seat and survived. The rumours came back instantly. Was it the stress, a fight with Rainier, medication, depression? We'll never know. The cameras rolled through the funeral, the last great performance. But behind the veils and roses, one thing stayed unsaid. The woman who gave up her career for a crown never really gave up the rest. And now we come to one of the most bizarre, cringe-worthy and globally televised sex scandals ever to slither out from under the plush carpets of Buckingham Palace. Tonight, you're eavesdropping through a telephone wire in the early 1990s, when answering machines still clicked, and tabloid front pages still sold by the millions. You've heard of royal gossip. But nothing compares to the moment when the future King of England was caught whispering sweet nothings about wanting to be a tampon. Yes, you've reached the soggy, squirm-inducing heart of the Camillagate tapes, and the unforgettable sexual PR disaster of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. Now let's rewind for context. At this point, Charles was married to Diana. On paper, they were the perfect couple, young, photogenic heirs to 1,000 fairy tales. But in reality, the marriage was already withering on the vine. By the late 80s, they were sharing more staff than affection. Publicly polite, privately frozen. Diana was battling bulimia, isolation, and increasing awareness that her husband was still very much in love with someone else. a woman he'd never really stopped loving. That woman, of course, was Camilla. Camilla Shand, later Parker Bowles, had been in Charles's life long before Diana. They'd met in the early 1970s and clicked instantly. She was confident, earthy, and utterly unimpressed by titles. While the palace deemed her unsuitable, too experienced, not aristocratic enough, already attached, Charles never got over her. They both married other people, but behind the formal smiles the affair rekindled, slowly, stealthily, and eventually spectacularly. Then came 93. A recording leaked. Not just a photograph, not just a whisper, but a full-blown 6-minute taped conversation between Charles and Camilla. It had been secretly recorded years earlier, and somehow found its way into the hands of the press. The tabloids didn't hesitate. One paper ran it under the headline, "Charles and Camilla, the tape that shocked the world." You're in a quiet room now, listening. It's late at night in the recording, and the voices are intimate, low, the way people talk when they think so, when they think no one's listening. Charles says, "I'll just live inside your trousers or something. It would be much easier." Camilla giggles. They flirt, laugh, joke about being reincarnated as various undergarments. And then he says it. "God forbid, a Tampax, just my luck." There's a pause, then more laughter, then more flirting. They talk about loving each other forever, about hating the time apart, about wanting to be in each other's sin. It's raw, weird, and, frankly, a little gross, but also deeply human. Two people in love saying dumb things, the kinds of things we all say when we're in that strange, giddy, irrational headspace. The problem was, they were royals, and the world was not prepared for royals to sound like high schoolers with landlines. The fallout? Apocalyptic. The British public, already suspicious of Charles and protective of Diana, exploded in mockery and disgust. Stand-up comedians had new material for years. School kids whispered Tampongate across playgrounds. Satirical shows replayed the quote endlessly. It became more than a scandal. It became a cultural touchstone, a permanent asterisk in the biography of the man who would be king. Camilla, once barely known to the public, was now a household name, and not in a good way. She was cast as the other woman, the homewrecker, the villain in the royal soap opera. Diana, meanwhile, was elevated to near sainthood. And Charles, well, he did what most royals do when embarrassed. He soldiered on, attended engagements, and pretended none of it happened, even though it very much did. Here's your historical fact. The Camillagate tapes were a real turning point in public perception of the royal family. They signalled a shift from deferential coverage to tabloid sensationalism, marking the end of the monarchy's ability to fully control its image. Your quirky fact? The scandal was so enduring that Tampax briefly became a banned word in UK press briefings at the time. Some editors instructed journalists to use euphemisms like sanitary product to avoid reader complaints. And your scholarly debate? Historians and royal commentators still argue whether the scandal was an inevitable exposure of human vulnerability or a symptom of an outdated system crumbling under the pressure of modern media. Was it tragic, comic, or just real life leaking through the cracks of an institution that insisted on being untouchable? You're standing now in Clarence House. The air is stiff with dignity. The hallways are lined with tasteful, expensive art, but somewhere down the corridor, a phone sits on a side table, old, plastic, beige, with buttons slightly worn. It's probably not the same one, but it feels like it might be. You imagine the receiver lifted, the whispered darling, the nervous laughter, the history-altering comment that no one could ever unhear. Charles eventually married Camilla in 2005, after decades of media storms and PR rehab. They're older now, quieter, steadier, but the echoes of that tape, still there, still floating in the background of every photo op, every state dinner, every awkward smile, because in the end, even the future King of England is just a man who said something stupid on the phone to a woman he couldn't stay away from. And history, well, history hit record. And now, like any truly unhinged royal saga, the quiet desperation of a tampon-fueled phone call leads directly into the storm of public breakdown, betrayal, and televised confession. Tonight, you're sitting cross-legged on a cream-coloured couch next to Princess Diana, lit softly from the side as she tells the world, calmly, clearly, and without flinching, that her marriage wasn't just broken, it was haunted by three people. Because in the story of Diana, sex wasn't just a backdrop, it was the bomb under the floorboards. It was pain, rebellion, revenge, and finally reclamation. So here you are in the 1990s. Britain is cracking under tabloid pressure. The royal family has become part soap opera, part trauma machine. Diana, once the shimmering fairy tale bride of Prince Charles, is now the most photographed, most scrutinised, and most dangerously self-aware woman in the world. She's done playing the demure wife. She's done smiling for photographs while her husband whispers to another woman. She's about to speak, and when she does, the whole world listens. But before the interviews, before the tears and the landmines and the slow, televised undoing of royalty, Diana had to live through the quiet kind of betrayal. Charles had resumed his affair with Camilla almost immediately after their wedding. Diana suspected it. Then she knew it. Then she watched as the palace, the press, and even members of her own staff circled the wagons around him. Not her, so she acted out. First in small ways, missing events, dodging protocol, giving off-the-cuff quotes. Then came the lovers. Some were rumoured, some were confirmed, and some were so public it was clear she wanted to be caught. Let's talk about James Hewitt, the red-haired cavalry officer who became Diana's riding instructor and very literal knight in shining armour. Their affair was intense, romantic, sexual. They took trips together, wrote love letters. He kept her perfume bottle beside his bed, and for a while he was her escape from royal isolation. Then came the tabloids, the headlines, the denial then confirmation, and the deeply unhelpful fact that her second son, Prince Harry, shared a certain ginger resemblance. Here's the thing. The timeline makes the paternity theory nearly impossible. Harry was born in 1984. Diana and Hewitt didn't begin their affair until 1986. But that didn't stop the speculation, or the public obsession, or the late-night jokes. Diana denied it. The palace denied it. And yet, here we are, still whispering about it decades later. Then there was Barry Manicky, her former bodyguard, possibly her first great love. Diana hinted more than once that she had been involved with him, deeply and emotionally, and that his sudden death in a motorcycle accident was suspicious. That word stuck. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. It added another layer of gothic tragedy to her legend. And then came Hasnat Khan, the reserved Pakistani heart surgeon who stole her heart, not with fame or flattery, but with quiet. He didn't want the spotlight, didn't need her for attention. He called her out when she was being melodramatic, and Diana adored him for it. But their relationship was doomed by culture, family pressure, and the fact that dating the most famous woman in the world is, objectively, a nightmare. He ended it. She mourned. So when she met Dodi Fayed, son of billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, it felt less like love and more like performance. She was newly single, he was extravagantly wealthy, and the tabloids needed a new storyline. They vacationed on yachts, they kissed in front of cameras, it was fast, loud, and messy. And it ended, as you know, in a Paris tunnel in a crumpled Mercedes, under the blinding flashes of paparazzi lenses. But before all of that, before the crash, the candles, the Elton John tribute, Diana did something extraordinary. In 1995, she sat down with journalist Martin Bashir and detonated the monarchy in real time. The BBC interview was simple in format but explosive in content. She admitted to her own affairs. She spoke openly about Charles and Camilla. She said the royal family had emotionally isolated her and that the institution was more concerned with tradition than humanity. Then came the line heard around the world. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply told the truth, or her truth anyway, and let it land. The palace was blindsided. The Queen was reportedly furious. Charles's team scrambled to restore his image. And the public? They picked a side. And overwhelmingly, they picked her. Here's your historical fact. Diana's 1995 Panorama interview reached over 22 million viewers in the UK alone, and millions more worldwide. It was one of the most watched television broadcasts in British history, and arguably the most damaging to the royal family's image in the 20th century. Your quirky fact: before the interview aired, palace aides reportedly considered sending her away, a half-serious, half-terrifying echo of how problematic royal women were once exiled to convents or castles. But instead, they just made her life even harder behind the scenes. And your scholarly debate? To this day, historians and royal biographers argue about whether Diana's confessions were a moment of bravery or emotional sabotage. Was she reclaiming her voice or burning down her legacy? Was the public ready for honesty, or did they just want a better show? Now you're in Kensington Palace. The lights are dimmed, the hallway smells faintly of roses and printer paper. Somewhere in a drawer is a VHS copy of that interview, grainy, iconic. On a nearby table, a framed photo of her sons, and beside it, a glass of water, still half full, or half empty, depending on who you ask. Diana's story didn't end in a bedroom, it ended in a tunnel. But everything that led to that moment, every kiss, every betrayal, every late-night phone call and daytime headline, was driven by a woman trying to claim her own narrative. And for a while she did, until the cameras took over again. Step carefully now, because we're no longer walking through the quiet halls of royalty, we're swiping through it, left, right, matched, unmatched. Welcome to the age where blue blood meets blue checkmarks, where tiaras flirt with Tinder, and NDAs are just as common as engagement rings. Tonight you're scrolling into the strange, glitchy, surprisingly messy world of modern royals on dating apps, a realm where palace walls are replaced by phone screens, and one poorly timed screenshot can blow up a centuries-old reputation faster than a guillotine ever could. Let's start with the basics. Being royal used to mean you didn't date. You married strategically. Often miserably. Love was optional, but now, royals aren't just allowed to fall in love. They're expected to do it publicly, romantically, and with enough photogenic sincerity to fill Instagram feeds for months. But where do you go when you're rich, titled, and deeply paranoid that everyone just wants a selfie or a scandal? Apparently, Raya. Raya, if you've never heard of it, is the dating app for celebrities and semi-famous people who are too cool for Tinder, but too scared for real life. It's invitation only, swaddled in NDAs, and about as self-consciously elite as it gets. And guess who's been spotted lurking there in recent years? That's right, royal cousins, distant dukes, and even a few direct heirs scrolling, matching, and ghosting just like the rest of us. Take Princess Eugenie and Princess Beatrice, both granddaughters of Queen Elizabeth II. They managed to dodge most scandal, but even they had brief brushes with app-based dating, especially during their post-university years. While neither of their current partners was swiped into their lives, friends of friends have whispered about the royal profiles that almost were. One anonymous insider claimed Beatrice was once on a beta list for a nobility-only dating platform that never got off the ground. Think of it as LinkedIn, but for awkward earls and their crumbling estates. But it's not just the women scrolling. Royal men have been caught too. Remember Peter Phillips, the Queen's eldest grandchild? When his marriage ended, he was reportedly spotted mingling on apps under a fake name, using carefully cropped photos, of course, though one reportedly still had a polo trophy in the background, because subtlety has limits. And a few obscure German and Scandinavian royals? Absolutely on the apps. They're lower on the succession charts, but not low on libido. Or Wi-Fi, but the biggest splashiest scandal in this arena came courtesy of Prince Harry. Not because he was caught swiping, but because he wasn't, and people still tried to match with him anyway. Long before Meghan Markle, Harry was the tabloid's favourite bad boy. Caught naked in Vegas, photographed doing tequila shots off questionable surfaces, and generally just giving the press a royal field day. Rumours swirled that he had dating profiles under fake names, James, Henry, one time allegedly Spike, and that women in London had been warned by friends. If he messages you, it's probably the Harry. Screenshot nothing. Say everything. When Harry and Meghan's romance became public, everyone wanted to know, how did they meet? The palace spun a charming tale of mutual friends and private introductions, but Meghan, in interviews, dropped a subtle detail. She Googled him. Of course she did. You would too. She wanted to see what she was getting into, which in the app age is a totally normal thing to do, but in royal terms, practically treasonous. Royals are supposed to be mysterious, unsearchable, timeless, not dateable. Of course, the shift from castles to phone screens has had consequences. One royal-adjacent figure, an Italian count's son, was exposed after a match leaked private messages, another minor royal's dating profile bio, which reportedly included the phrase "naughty earl looking for a proper lady," made it onto Twitter, and nearly ruined a family's coat of arms. And then there's the NDAs. That's the real plot twist of royal dating in the 21st century. Several members of noble families, including some directly tied to reigning houses, have required matches to sign confidentiality agreements before the first drink. Yes, really. Swipe right, sign here. Some have teams who scan social media before and after each date. One woman described being gently but firmly asked to delete a selfie she took inside a royal adjacent bathroom because the tiles gave away the location. Here's your historical fact. As of the 2020s, there are over 30 European royal families still in existence, many with younger, single members now navigating dating in the digital era. Tradition hasn't vanished. It's just being filtered. Your quirky fact. In 2015, a Dutch baron actually launched a dating app exclusively for nobility and old money types. It was called Toffee. It failed almost immediately, but the screenshots live on in delicious infamy. And your scholarly debate? The question is no longer should royals date like normal people, but can they? Is the fantasy of monarchy compatible with the blunt, swipe-happy world of modern courtship? Can someone be both aspirational and available? You're sitting now in a luxury apartment in Mayfair. It's tastefully beige, with just enough family portraits to hint at noble blood. On the glass coffee table sits a gold iPhone unlocked. The screen glows with a half-written message. "Hey," it says, "saw your profile, love your smile. Also, do you mind signing something before we meet?" There's a coat of arms engraved on the phone case and a condom in the drawer. This is what royal dating looks like now. Filtered, cautious, branded, but still undeniably human. The rules have changed. The scandals haven't. You've scrolled through the dating apps, you've watched royalty become swipeable, but now it's time to strap in, literally, because we're flying first class into a world where sex, money, and absolute power fuse together at 35,000 feet. Welcome to the secretive, shimmering, and extravagantly indulgent universe of Saudi princes and their private jet harems. You've made it to the desert palaces and mirrored penthouses of the modern Gulf aristocracy, where what happens in the sky stays untraceable, unless someone leaks the NDAs. Saudi Arabia has no shortage of royalty, with thousands of princes in the extended House of Saud and billions of oil dollars flowing through their veins. The country's royal family makes most European monarchies look like thrift store cosplay. And while many Saudi royals maintain a low profile in global media, tight-lipped, power-suited, ultra-discreet, there are others who've turned luxury and lust into a lifestyle so outrageous it makes Buckingham Palace look like a modest Airbnb. Let's start with the basics. In public, most Saudi royals project an image of devout religiosity and conservative values. But in private, very private, some of the younger generation party like the clock's ticking, and they do it far from home. Think London, Monaco, Ibiza, and the Maldives. But the real playground? Private jets, not just for travel but for entertainment. Sex, secrecy, and sky-high logistics. You're boarding one of these jets now. The interiors are more Versailles than Boeing. Gold faucets, crystal chandeliers, a cigar room, a cinema, and in the back, a VIP rest area that looks less like a lounge and more like the fantasy suite from a particularly unhinged dating show. Persian carpets, circular beds, mood lighting, and a locked drawer with event jewellery for guests who forgot theirs. Now meet the guests. Hand-picked models, influencers, and actresses. Many of them flown in from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. They're booked through a network of high-end fixers, some operating out of luxury PR firms, others more closely aligned with private talent management agencies. Women are offered eye-watering sums for appearances at parties that may or may not involve anything other than looking beautiful. But the unspoken rules are clear. Don't ask too many questions, don't post photos, and above all, don't speak afterward. That's where the NDAs come in. Some are longer than prenups, multiple pages, binding in multiple jurisdictions. You sign one before the jet even leaves the tarmac, agreeing never to reveal who was on the plane, what was served, or why you were given a $40,000 Cartier bracelet as a thank you for your presence. And yes, the sex is real, at least sometimes. Many of these events are, to put it politely, covert orgies in couture, a rotating cast of royalty, billionaires and their guests, often under the guise of private art shows, fashion previews or charity events. One notorious story involves a prince who allegedly flew in 15 women for a spa retreat aboard his yacht, which just happened to have a helipad, a DJ booth, and a retractable stripper pole. Another, more grim account describes women being forced to surrender their phones and submit to body checks before being allowed to board a royal-owned aircraft, then told they weren't allowed to leave for 72 hours. Of course, not all Saudi princes partake. Many are educated, professional, and quietly reformist. But those who do indulge, they do so with the kind of recklessness that only comes from knowing that, legally and financially, you're almost impossible to touch. And when scandals do break, they're often muffled. In 2015, a Saudi prince was arrested in Los Angeles after multiple women accused him of sexual assault in a rented Beverly Hills mansion. The charges were dropped. The prince went home, the story vanished within weeks. But insiders say that wasn't the only party he hosted in that mansion, just the one that went public. Here's your historical fact. The House of Saud includes over 15,000 members, though only a few hundred hold real power. Since the oil boom of the mid-20th century, Saudi royalty has become one of the wealthiest dynasties in human history, with some estimates placing its collective wealth at over $1 trillion. Your quirky fact: one prince once reportedly bought out all of Disneyland Paris for a single day, just so he and his entourage could enjoy the rides without mixing with commoners. Allegedly, a part of the park was turned into a model runway complete with fan-blown hair. And your scholarly debate? This raises major questions about modern monarchy and moral hypocrisy. Can a royal family project conservative religious values at home while funding libertine escapades abroad? Is this global indulgence just the new face of soft power? Or is it a grotesque contradiction that undermines royal legitimacy? You're standing now in a penthouse suite overlooking the Dubai skyline. The air smells like oud roses and very expensive gilt. On the table, a gold tray of untouched macarons. Next to it, a phone vibrating silently. Another message from another fixer. The plane's ready. You'll love the guest list. In the next room, laughter, music, a clink of glass, and a half-open jewellery case glittering under soft, filtered light. No cameras, no evidence, just memory, and maybe a regret or two. This is the new royal scandal, not born in castles but in VIP lounges and silent Gulf airstrips. It's rich, it's reckless, and for now, it's completely untouchable. We've soared through sex tapes, swiped through royal dating apps, and now glided across a private jet or two. But tonight we land on the one idea that has shaped, destroyed, and remade dynasties, more than any sword, war, or bloodline ever could. Desire. Physical, emotional, forbidden, flaunted. In this final chapter, you're standing at the threshold of the throne room and the bedroom, where passion doesn't just shape lives, it reshapes history. Because when it comes to royal sex secrets, the real power doesn't lie in the scandal. It lies in what the scandal changes. Think back. It started with Henry VIII, ripping apart Christendom not for theology, but for a woman's touch. His obsession with Anne Boleyn, her eyes, her body, her promise of a son, led to the English Reformation. Entire continents split, not because of the ideology, but because a king wanted to sleep with someone the Pope wouldn't approve. Then there was Catherine the Great, whose legend is still tangled in lies about horses and orgies, because a powerful woman with a sex life remains a historical threat. Never mind that she expanded an empire, brought enlightenment to Russia, and rewrote the rulebook on female power. All anyone remembers is what may or may not have happened behind her velvet curtains. Or Marie Antoinette, accused of lesbian affairs, incest, and orgies by pamphlets so obscene they might have been written by tabloid time travellers. She died with dignity, but history kept circling her bedroom like a vulture. Because once desire becomes public, it eats everything around it. And let's not forget the abdication of Edward VIII, who gave up the British Empire not because of war or crisis, but for Wallis Simpson, the woman whose sexual mystique became royal currency. Or Princess Margaret, who wielded sexuality like a sword in a world that told her to sit down and smile. She didn't. She stood, smoked, stripped, danced on tables. Every generation's throne has come with its own bedsheet scandal. Sometimes they were buried, like the rumours around Prince Albert Victor, too fragile for kingship, maybe too complicated for history to look in the eye. Other times they were paraded, like Charles and Diana, whose imploding marriage and crossword affairs were beamed into living rooms around the world. And now we live in an age where monarchy and modesty no longer cohabitate. Royals date on apps, they party in Vegas, post on Instagram, get caught in leaked voicemails about tampons, or fly models to secret islands. Desire is no longer the shadowy secret behind palace doors, it's part of the brand. Here's your final historical fact. No monarchy has ever survived purely on divine right. Behind every enduring crown is a well-managed image, and nothing shatters that image faster than sexual scandal. Your final quirky fact? One unnamed European prince, according to two separate palace insiders, insists on being addressed as your royal sexiness at private parties. If you think that's a joke, you've clearly never met a man born with a tiara and a trust fund. And your final scholarly debate? Is royalty still relevant in an age where we know what kind of underwear they prefer? Can the myth of noble blood survive when every A cloud has a potential leak? Or have these very scandals, these whispered confessions and viral embarrassments, made them more human, and thus, paradoxically, more enduring? You're back now in the long echoing gallery of every royal residence. The portraits stare at you, stoic, composed, untouched. But you know better now. Behind each canvas is 1,000 secrets, a mistress just out of frame, a journal under lock and key, a letter burned, a smile faked. Because the real throne has always been a little closer to the sheets. It's in the tension between duty and desire, in the gap between crown and craving, in that soft, dangerous moment when a royal leans too far into love and the world leans in, camera in hand. Sex hasn't just shaped monarchies. It's detonated them, hidden them, reinvented them again and again, and as long as there are crowns to wear and humans to desire, the story will keep repeating. And you've just heard 25 of the most intimate, outrageous, and history-shaking royal sex secrets ever whispered. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and remember, if kings can fall for lust, so can anyone.